I'm in Europe right now, Chris, doing a series of, we're still filming
Oh, excellent.
DVDs, and also was invited to do a series on symbolism and satanic cults and what have you here in Gothenburg, Sweden. So
Excellent.
we're doing that. It's a series.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, especially last minute like this. The topic, as I told you off air, is Helena Blavatsky and this whole theosophy. I mean, what really piqued my interest was their motto, "There is no religion above truth." And that's something that I've always felt in my heart. But you talk a lot about Satanism, you talk about a lot about Luciferianism, and that you expose all these people, but then it turns around and a lot of people make Helena Blavatsky and the whole Theosophic Society look like Satan worshippers. Can we set the record straight?
Well, the people who are doing that, of course, are coming from either little knowledge or they have a Christian persuasion. Nothing essentially wrong with that. But unfortunately, there can be downsides to that. I've often emphasized time and time again in my work that these partisan affiliations can be detrimental when you're in this particular subject matter. I've gone even deeper than that, of course, and said that, look, actually, you're actually in an occult sphere of knowledge in which your settings have to be adjusted. But even without going into that, still, there is very much a detrimental skewing of certain facts. And I think this can be proven quite clearly by objective researchers, so that when you're coming, it's no different than we would find if for instance Catholic writers were commenting on Calvin or Luther or Protestantism. It'd be no different if Lutherans, or Methodists were trying to comment on Catholicism. It's no different if Christians were critiquing Judaism or Jews were critiquing, Christianity, or Western political pundits were critiquing, communism. You have this. So we always have to bear in mind that you may be interested in a certain subject matter. You may even have lots of fascinating, scintillating facts at your disposal. Your research may be very needed in the world. But at the same time, we have to also bear in mind that almost every person that writes, every person who speaks, every person who holds an opinion also has a prejudice. And in the occult area, which I totally myself believe that this conspiratorial information is basically an occult subject, there can be downsides to that. And this is what we then find in a hardcore way when you hear critiques of certain people. And therefore you have to be very conscious of that. We forget about it, of course, because it's so close to us. These prejudices that we have, these affiliations, these partisan beliefs are absolutely so close to us. We wear them like clothes, so we forget that this is the case. And so that objectivity is often lost. And it's certainly to be found in all areas of life. It's to be found in politics, it's to be found in the academics who have this prejudice. It's found in all manner of scholars. And then, of course, it's like a snowball effect. One person may disseminate either deliberately or misgivenly or even benignly a certain fallacy about a particular person. That snowballs. Another author picks that up without research, continues it. Next thing it's on TV. Next thing it's on radio. And the snowball keeps going. And before you know it, it appears that these fallacies are then taken for facts. And it can be very, very difficult to then, convince somebody to do away with all of that and look with fresh eyes. And another point, of course, pertaining to this is that little knowledge. Unfortunately, people don't do the homework. And one particular area, which is very, very, very pernicious, is that people will debunk or they will criticize a particular scholar and almost even verbally then tell you once you quiz them on it that they haven't even actually read it, or they'll even be so ridiculous to tell you, well, why should I read that person? I know they're a fake.
I've seen that.
Hang on a minute.
I've seen that on the forums.
I'll give you several reasons why you should. Because number one, you're blurting something out, and you may be wrong. That's number one. And two, your voice is now being heard by very, very many people. That's why you should know what you're talking about. And of course, we can't even get past that. That person will just be adamant about it. No, I'm not going to do it. I know that this person's a fake. I've heard that on the grapevine. My best friend told me. I don't need to go and read that person's original works. And by the way, this is not a modern prejudice. This is something that 500, 600 years ago, you can still find this kind of mentality in operation.
Well, it never ceases to amaze me. Well, first of all, my research shows that Blavatsky's work was basically hijacked by the Theosophic Society and turned into something completely different. And when I point this out to Christians, they turn around and say, well, no, it was Alice Bailey, is that her name? Alice Bailey was a disciple. And I said, no, Alice Bailey hijacked her ideas. Now, they can't understand the connection. They can understand the connection, though, where Christianity was hijacked by Catholicism and turned into something else. Why can't these people understand that the same thing applies with Theosophy?
Oh, I totally agree. And in fact, they're quite wrong, because one of the top, and I think most brilliant writers within the Christian movement, conspiratorial, there's several of these people like Eustace Mullins, many of them are my own personal mentors. Another one I recommend is James D. Wardner, who wrote a brilliant book called Unholy Alliance. It is written by a Christian author, he is a Christian, and he absolutely confirms that Blavatsky was swept aside, and clearly shows you that he doesn't implicate her, but he certainly implicates these Masonic Fabian types that she loathed on sight. Many people mistakenly talk about Blavatsky being a socialist because a lot of her doctrines, or some of her doctrines, were then, I would go so far as to say, plagiarized, literally lifted from her occult work, reframed in a political framework, because this was common at the time, and there was even reason sociologically why that happened. And it was also to discredit her. Well, these doctrines were lifted, symbols were lifted. I mean, it is an absolute fact that the swastika that her organization used, not in anything like a Nazi context at all. We have to always remember that Blavatsky was an Oriental scholar. She had very little time for Western mystery traditions or Western intellectual knowledge. She was primarily focused on India and those paths and Tibet. And so she used the swastika as a symbol of the gods, as a symbol of enlightenment. She was very into astrotheology, so the swastika has a legitimate connotation there. Well, of course, then later on, people like Guido von List and other people after she died who called themselves theosophists used those symbols on their political documents, something I don't believe she ever would have endorsed. But people don't need to believe me on that. They should go and read it for themselves and find out. So yeah, certain symbols, certain aspects of her ideology were lifted, reframed, recooked in a different sauce, and then of course she gets the blame. But as a matter of fact, Alice Bailey's husband, and their circle, which was very much a British circle. You have to remember that Blavatsky herself was Russian. She had absolutely no connection whatsoever to any of these Masonic, Illuminati, Rosicrucian, or royal figures. In fact, she warned about them all through her life. And again, if you haven't read her works, then you wouldn't know this, and you'd believe all of this hearsay. Now, having said that, you see, I'm not supremely. First of all, I'm not an authority on Madame Blavatsky. I like her for very specific reasons, which are pretty much independent of a lot of the other ways that she's known. I don't agree with a lot of her work at all. In fact, a lot of my work is to try and update and renovate many topics. For instance, the concept of the Aryans or the concept of Atlantis. And also I myself, I'm fascinated with the Western mystery tradition, and therefore that's a huge area in which I would depart from Madame Blavatsky. I am not a fan of Eastern religions, Eastern yogas, or any of that concept pertaining, you see, to a lot of these Vedantic doctrines. I've studied them. I think they're fascinating, but I'm not particularly of that school. She was. So that's one area where I would have very big differences with her, and there's many other ones as well, including the concepts of root races and so forth and so on. But that's I have that difference with so many people. So I must say that first of all. But at the same time, I like her because she was a genius. She was a fantastic author who on several points had the most amazing things to say about things that are very, very important. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but many of her critics, people who on the first reading of her works really disliked her, have actually gone on record to say that later on, as years went by, sometimes even as decades went by, and then they reread her works, they started to find out that many of the things that she was talking about, even some of the most obscure things, actually were coming to pass. So rather than being some sort of grandmother of the New Age movement, or sort of a patron of, you know, masonry or devilish sort of cabals, this woman warned about these cabals all her life, and warned about the New Age movement, warned about the misuse of knowledge, esoteric knowledge, just as Rudolf Steiner did as well. And see, it's on a second and third reading of her works in a new context. So again, you have to also say, okay, who were her critics? A lot of them existed at her own time. In fact, her most vehement critics existed pretty much when she did. They were contemporaries, and therefore a lot of what they said is now rendered useless to us, because time has moved on. We see her light more, we see what she was saying more, and their idiotic critiques hardly hold any water. In fact, the only one that probably still holds a little bit of water is the more academic critique that she didn't source her works as well as she might. And there's even rebuttals for that. I don't know if we have time to go into that as to why she did that. But that is actually one critique that you could say, yeah, okay, you know, she was at fault there and should have sourced things more. And then we'd look into the reasons why she didn't do that, etc. But a lot of the other critiques of her have all been completely solved. And I believe, dismissed in many ways. And if anything, as time goes by, we start to see the really profound genius of people like her.
I agree. I mean, one thing that really stuck out to me was that we're all have the God spirit in us. We're all capable of this higher consciousness. And as a matter of fact, wasn't she the first person to really explain in depth about human spirituality?
Sure she did, but very much so. She was very interested in that. And these, of course, tie in with her metaphysical ideas, many of which I'm not a person who agrees with. But at the same time, sure, I like her for one specific thing, and that she had a very strong doctrine of the self, which reminds me very deeply of Ayn Rand. For instance, she has a quote that, if I may, I'd like to read.
Absolutely.
She says that the pivotal doctrine of the esoteric philosophy admits no privileges or special gifts in man, save those won by his own ego through personal effort and merit. So she's absolutely saying that, look, just because she's a medium herself, or just because she's a so-called spiritualist, you know, in quotation marks, and just because she deals with mysticism, she still has her feet on the ground and understands that, look, no gifts are going to come to your mind, no worthy gifts, unless you've earned them. It's up to you. It's about where you start from. It's the kind of person you are. It's the road that you choose to take and the pace that you walk on. That will be the most important thing when it comes to revelations of all kinds. So again, yes, she looked to the person. And of course, that immediately put her at loggerheads with all institutions. Because all institutions say, well, that doesn't really matter. You're kind of not really meant to focus on the kind of person you are. You just conform to our way. You just believe in our little gurus. You just read our little holy book. And most of those things will be ironed out. All those problematic differences of your psychology and your personality and your ups and downs and even your psychological anxieties, we'll take care of all of that, because we know that you're a wastrel, but now when you join our order, you know, we'll take care of it all. So, of course, that was one reason why I think the officialdom had such a problem with her. There was actually much deeper reasons why they had problems with her, and it's because of her statements about the Jews and their antiquity. Uh-huh. It was her statements about the absolute criminality of the Christian Church, particularly the Vatican. These were in her great book, which I refer to a lot, which is Occult Doctrine, The Secret Doctrine, Volume 3, which is also sometimes called Occultism, that book. And one thing I must add, while we're on that subject, is that all her critics, this is every single one that I've been able to find, who critique her on various things, never mention those quotes, which I have throughout my works. I've repeated even those quotes. I have them in several slideshows, I have them on DVDs, and I've used the same quotes from that book in the Irish Origins of Civilization, and I think 2 or 3 turned up in the Astrotheology book. So I've constantly referred to these quotes because I think they're that important, and it's one of the reasons, as I said, is I really like her for that. Then you turn around and say, well, this book was available. Researchers should have this book. These quotes are not like sort of invisible. They can be found. How come then In the works of all her so-called critics, you never find this. And yet these are the same critics who then blame her about being a Rosicrucian, a Mason, being good friends with Giuseppe Mazzini, the head of the Illuminati, who's meant to have initiated her. And you'll even find terms like this in the work of David Icke, with no sourcing, with no references to when that event took place, or did it even happen, or where's your sources, you see? So this snowball effect, where even very great scholars and researchers can make this mistake, just because they've happened to hear about it. And then you go deeper and you find that this is probably not even the case, and there's no sources about it. But then, as I said, coming back to what I was saying earlier, where are the quotes that show her openly critiquing the Jesuits? And then what do you make of critics who blame her of being a member of the Illuminati? This is just one area where they criticize her, when anybody who's done even like any deep type of research at all knows that there's not a hair's breadth difference between the Jesuit order and the Illuminati. In fact, when you really do your homework, as I've done, you know that they're one and the same. And I don't care if the Jesuits call themselves the Roman cult, which is in fact a term that they actually use. There's actually a phrase, a term known as the Order of the Roman Cult, which is nothing more than what the Jesuits are now. Whether they call themselves Propaganda Due, the Children of Loyola, I don't care what terms they give themselves. The Alan Dumbros or whatever, all the different Hydra heads that they've had, you see, how they've disguised themselves. When anybody knows that, look, the Illuminati was formed by the Jesuits, there's not a hair's breadth difference about them. How can then the person who should know that then claim that Madame Blavatsky was a member of the Illuminati when so many efforts she went into to point out the criminality of the Jesuits? You see, so again, there's a contradiction right there. So that, unfortunately, the people who come to a lot of this work for the first time, who don't know these pieces, who don't put these pieces together, will fall for those very shaky, theories. And that's why I spend a little bit more time going into Blavatsky, not because I'm a Blavatskyite or a theosophist. It's just I hate that kind of thing. And since my work is so full of references of other teachers and thinkers, I will spend the extra time to clear up the disinformation on Blavatsky, because I just will not tolerate it, because it's absolutely contradictory, and I can point out the areas where it's contradictory. And I'm really glad that you gave me the opportunity to go into it a little bit in this particular interview.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That's one thing that I want to clear up too, is a lot of the inconsistencies, because I see them all over the place, and I want to get to the truth. And I know we won't be able to even scratch the surface, but we do have unlimited time, so feel free to take as much time as you'd like. One thing that really stuck out though is that over 120 years ago, she was calling out the Catholic Church and all the evils there, and we're starting to see it all come out now. The Vatican is crumbling, in my opinion, with all these scandals and this child sex, and the way the Pope is just defending everybody. So and that's just the surface of the corruption of the Vatican.
I was just going to say that. You took the words right out of my mouth. I was just going to say that is only the tip of the iceberg.
It's what people can see in front of their face, though. So at least they can see that something's wrong. But oh yeah, it goes way, way deeper than that.
That's right, and people need to pick up the works of Baron Avro Manhattan. People can get into the work of Father Alberto, Malachi Martin. Other names will come to me who have gone into greater depth to show what kind of an institution this is. But people can find these references in my work and on the websites to these books. There's many, many books on the Jesuit order. Certainly I'd recommend the work of Eric John Phelps, you see, and others will come to mind, but I can certainly even be contacted for lists of this work. But I would certainly put at the top of the list is Baron Avro Manhattan. His works can now be found, at least most of them, on Amazon and other places.
Let me ask you this. A lot of people say that she's the mother of the New Age movement. Is that an inaccurate statement?
Oh yeah, I think it is. I think it is, because first of all, what the New Age movement became. You see, the most important thing to always bear in mind when you're talking about Blavatsky that will solve a lot of problems, it's sort of like a rule of thumb with her, and that is that she had no time for politics. So anyone who points to a movement that is in any way geared politically, which as a matter of fact the New Age movement is, because the people like Barbara Marx Hubbard and various other sort of leading alumni within the New Age movement were, in fact, people very close to the corridors of power. Annie Besant was the same. She was a Fabian. And these are people who are very, very locked in to not only the royal families, but many institutions like the London School of Economics and many other think tank type organizations, and they had a political orientation. And when I say political, I'm also talking royal, because the Theosophical Society later on started to very much lean towards, one of the reasons why I think it was hijacked is because they wanted the nobility to become involved. Nobility have always been interested in Masonry and quasi-Masonic orders, we know this. And so the Theosophists started to pander to these guys even more. There was a certain amount of it when Blavatsky was alive, but it wasn't anything like what happened after the period. It's one of the reasons why Krishnamurti also decided to break away from the entire Theosophical edifice. His reasons were primarily philosophical, but he also loathed the fact that it was just knee-deep in all sorts of, dukes and princes and all sorts of royalty who were, spurious in his eyes. And I believe that Blavatsky, like Krishnamurti, had no time for politics. They didn't see any legitimate connection between occultism, mysticism, the journey of selfhood, and politics. To them, they were completely the opposite. One was like the spawn of the devil to them, the real evil, so to speak.
Yeah.
And the other was, an intellectual, spiritual concept. But this changed. And people, again, it's so close to us, we wouldn't notice. Because when we hear that, there was famous theosophists like Bulwer Lytton, and oh my goodness, we have George Bernard Shaw, and even the Bertrand Russell types, we immediately blame that on Blavatsky. But hang on a minute, each of those people had very deep ties to British royalty. Now, I don't remember any case of Queen Victoria, of Blavatsky, going up there and being invited to Buckingham Palace. I don't remember her being invited to any such org, or shaking the hands of any dignitaries or royal figures of that level, or hobnobbing with them. She was a hermit. She was practically poverty-stricken, which accounts for one of the reasons why her books weren't sourced, amongst other things, and so forth and so on. And in fact, coming to Bulwer Lytton, because of many, many people in their books that you'll read will always link her, not just with Giuseppe Mazzini, as we said, but with this character Bulwer Lytton, who was a famous author, who was an extremely high-level Freemason. And his son, in fact, was the Viceroy and Governor General of India in the 19th century, right? Very elite people working directly under Queen Victoria and these Habsburgs and Saxe-Coburg-Gothas. And it was actually under Bulwer Lytton's, his son, under that governorship, that the Lytton family produced opium in massive quantities. They were agents of the British, the East India Company, you see. Mm-hmm. And these are some of the most, in my opinion, the most demonic people. These are people who then later on went to set up the Russell Trust, the Virginia Companies, you see, the Skull and Bone Societies, all of these groups and organizations. And then what do you find? That the very people who are busy critiquing Madame Blavatsky don't even know about these other names, or mention them only in passing. What about your Coit Gilmans? What about your Tafts? What about, these Albrights and Harrimans? What about the people who are going around creating mass murder on this planet, who are filthy rich? Like these Livingstones and Guggenheims and whoever. The list is endless, right, of the people that you can actually put the finger on, like these Bulwer Lyttons and so many other organizations. Or even if you want to fast forward up to the sort of Nazi era or pre-Nazi era, you don't have enough people to critique. The people who don't even know about the von Thissens, and the people who don't know anything about Helmut Schlacht, or that Paul Warburg funded Hitler, or that Prescott Bush. Of course, some of this information is slowly coming out now.
Right, the Union Banking Corporation.
The names of the prime movers, right, in the world conspiracy are absolutely, the list is like filing cabinets long, and you'll find these books of authors who never even mention this, but it's Blavatsky this, Blavatsky that, all the way through their books. It's pathetic.
She arrived in New York penniless, right?
Sure. She traveled all over the world penniless.
Let me ask you this, though. I heard that she came from a wealthy family, though. Is that not true?
They were somewhat wealthy in the sense that they were, I think it was on the mother's side, I'm not quite sure, was connected to the elite, the nobility within Russia. But that doesn't mean that they were rolling in wealth. They were descended from nobility. And her mother, in fact, was a sort of a child prodigy herself, a very famous writer, who she died at like 28 years of age, her mother. But in that time, she had already written like a dozen novels and was considered like the George Sand of Russia. And I think her father had a post, it was originally from Germany, and had a pretty good job and had come and settled in Russia. So yeah, they lived. They were comfortable, and her grandparents also had a very, very, very large library, which played a great role in the girl's life because she and her sister also became a very well-known novelist. So writing, literature was in their family, and this big, big library that her grandparents owned played a huge role. And right where she lived, in fact, there was I think he was like 100 years old. He was the local Russian sage, this kind of seer or prophet. And he always said that Madame Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, would go on to do amazing things, and she was special and not like everybody else. And again, that brings us back to another interesting point, which connects to controversy in the world. When you are a genius, and remember, contradictions, by the way, are the hallmark of a genius. I know how people haven't really been able to swallow this yet. They point to these contradictions in a person's personality, like a Van Gogh, or a Wilhelm Reich, you see, and all of these kinds of things, these people, and go, oh, they're just so contradictory. Yeah, but it sounds strange to say it, but contradictions are actually very much the hallmark of a genius type, who's living, who's working in their mind, who's developing, and yeah, yesterday's person that they were may not be the same as the guy you meet one day later. Well, what's to compete with that? The guy that you meet 10 years ago and he's exactly the same when you meet him again? So, okay, contradictions may not be pleasant on paper, but those are actually the hallmark of a person who's constantly growing, constantly developing.
I totally agree with that. It's what I tell people. If you're not constantly evolving and changing your views because of new information coming in, you're doing something wrong.
Right. And then getting back to Blavatsky, you see, this is a woman as well. Hey, not only that, she's not just a normal introvert, a normal prodigy, a normal sort of a scholarly person who doesn't want to get married and doesn't want to, go to work in a factory or join the military or, anything else that these families encourage people to do, right? In fact, she had to live on a military barracks after the mother died. So her father, they lived in the custody of a military barracks for a long period of time, and she was shunted about from here to there. But of course, what happens in a girl's life in the Victorian age, the very first thing you know is that they're being married off to some, guy 30 years older than them or what have you. And this is the kind of lifestyle that she was offered and didn't want anything to do with it. That already is tantamount to being called a devil worshipper in those days, or somebody who needed the treatment, to hose you down or dunk you down. I mean, and I don't think things are really much different today when it really comes to it. But you can imagine a girl brought up in the 1800s who was introverted, sensitive, scholarly, knowledgeable, mediumistic, a female, and then at the same time a genius. I don't think you're going to win too many friends. And this is exactly what happened. And it's part of the reason why she took off. It's one of the reasons why she got on horseback and buggered off to Egypt first, I think it was, and then tried to make her way, from there over into India. Then that didn't work because they actually didn't let her into Tibet. What people don't realize is that the British government officials didn't like her or something, and some controversy happened. And it's in her official biographies that have been written by A.P. Sinnott. He's the one that really has the goods on her. A.P. Sinnott. In fact, do you realize that for up until she was almost 50 years of age, Madame Blavatsky was pretty much unknown in the world?
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, it was only until very late in her life. Certainly history would have easily forgotten about her. It's just that a guy called A.P. Sinnott went to Russia and interviewed her folks and tried to put some information together because he had found out about her, and that got her notoriety. She was known in her time, of course, to the small circle. She had formed the Theosophic Society and she had written her books. But what that means is that you get your moment, you get your 15 minutes of fame, and then you die away. In a historical context, people were forgetting about her. So she wasn't as super famous as a lot of the other people that came along afterwards, you see. So her name was sort of was falling aside, by the wayside. And it was because of A.P. Sinnott's book and a few other things that, again, secured her name a little bit more, But her idea to run, to leave and to travel, she went to Mexico. She spent lots and lots of time in America, as you said. Got to know some very interesting people there, some of them wealthy and some of them not so. And went to live even with Native American Indians. Took lots of notes, you see, went around the world. And so again, a woman in those days, that was not common, especially for a woman who didn't really have a lot of wealth. And so having that kind of knowledge, having that kind of experience is extremely rare. How many people, for instance, in the Eastern Bloc, how many women from the Third World in those days ever travel into the West to have that kind of experience? And how many people from the West, women, were able to, just like Marco Bloody Polo, take off and visit the entire world, not just the world, not just nightclubs in Miami, but go to ancient sites like Palenque, go over to Knossos, go over to Thebes, go over to Tibet. Very, very few. So by the time that this lady was 20 years of age or 25 years of age, she had more knowledge, more worldly experience than probably everyone she ever met. And then she went into counseling. She used to have these people come to her home. She'd do readings. She'd do consultations. And most of those backstabbing, I'm not going to use my Irish, but most of those backstabbing people would then go away, and they'd be the very ones, Chris, to write her up and criticize her and say all sorts of slanderous things. All the people she entertained.
Amazing.
Yeah. Her secretary, J.R.S. Mead, said that there wasn't a thing in her house that she didn't give to her guests. If her guests came to her premises, her house, everything was theirs. She had open house all the time. She was one of the most generous people that she ever knew. She lavished gifts and favor and time and energy on her friends openly, and was an extremely humanitarian person, and was very, very tolerant of some of the freakiest people coming to badger her with her life story. And therefore, and then the most saddest thing of all, which often follows genius types, is that these are the very people then who go to the journalists and the newspapers and the scandal mongers, you see, and talk about her this and her that and all sorts of weirdness. She smokes too many cigarettes. My goodness, she's very fat. She doesn't care about her appearance, etc., etc., etc. So, you're dealing with layers and layers and layers of scandal. It's just, and I put it down to the same fate as what women suffered in those days. This is the reason why the George Eliots and the Jane Austens had in the early days changed their names to write as men. Emily Bronte had to do it. Charlotte Bronte had to do it. There's barely a female writer that you can think of until you come up to the time of, say, the Gothic novel with, Mary Shelley, and what's her name? The one who originated the Gothic novel was actually a woman. That's an interesting subject, by the way. Anne something, I can't remember her name right now. But that's quite late. That's already, you're well into the middle of the 1900s. Previous to the 19th century, women could barely use their own name when they wrote even a book or a novel.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
It's just to be born in mind.
Let me ask your take on this. Somebody in the chat room is asking, what do you think about Manly P. Hall?
I've learned a lot from Manly Palmer Hall. His book was, a friend in California gave me his book in 1981. It was a really big, in those days it was the oversized hardback. They kind of made it smaller now, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And the reason why I like that book and like that work is because, number one, it's really good. It's really well written. And also is because that book, if you read it, will save you 30 years reading a load of other junk. He compresses so much into that one book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. He's written many others, of course. That is a very good book to use to help the beginner. And I've often even given that book to associates, people, that have shown an interest. I will always recommend that to them because it's so good for that purpose as a reference book. Again, I'm not that up on a lot of the other stuff he wrote or what his own order was into. But again, see, the other thing about Manly Palmer Hall was that even though he was a Freemason and things like that, he also spoke about the dark side of these secret societies. And I have great respect for insiders who do that. In fact, my work wouldn't even exist without these insiders, because there's really not that much information that you can go to that's legitimate just on the street level when you get into conspiracy, unfortunately. You're going to end up going to the Carol Quigleys and the generals, and the priests and the clergymen and the whistleblowers from within. And I put Manly Palmer Hall into that category. We've learned more from an Aldous Huxley. We've learned more from a Lieutenant Colonel James Bogrites. We've learned, and this is happening right now, as a matter of fact. There's whistleblowing books by, like Webley, what's his name, Smedley Butler. War is a Racket, and so many others I could name if I had the time. These are insiders. They've been behind the veil of national security. They know firsthand. They've wined and dined with the lieutenants of the Black Lodge. They have sat beside the politicians. They've overheard. They know things from within, and therefore their books are of maximum importance. And therefore I put people like Manly Palmer Hall in that category. They traveled the world. Doors were open to them. They were not open to everybody else. And therefore you may not like them, But that's okay. Their work may still have value, just in the same way that you might like something, but it may not be good for you. You may like to eat a lot of sugar. It doesn't mean it's good for you. Well, the reverse is the case. You may not like something, not like it, but it could be absolutely brilliant in a wider context. And see, I've always borne that in mind, because I don't come from any partisan belief. I grew up surrounded by people in the New Age movement, and within a very short time, I wanted nothing to do with them. You know, I was right in the heart of it. Back and quite from an earlier time as well.
What is the New Age movement? I mean, how would that be defined?
Well, that's again, you know, a whole subject in itself. Of course, the New Age movement I'm talking about would have been started by. Oh, well, it's hard to say. From an American context, you've got the Reverend Paul Solomon, who I have a lot of respect for. My own grandfather was involved with that, Tara Singh. You know, and then you have the East Coast variety, like the Barbara Marx Hubbards, and you have, you know, it might be, you could say, you could take it back to even people like Edgar Cayce and so forth and so on. But I would always define the negative aspect of it. All I can do is talk from personal experience. I can only say that a couple of the things I didn't like, personally, was that I'm a very good reader of people, and therefore, if somebody's personality, way of living, I don't even know what you really call it, doesn't jive with what they're talking about. And I don't mean them having bullet holes. I don't mind that. I don't mind a few rough edges. You know what I'm saying? It's fine. You know, I'm not talking about those superficial things. I'm talking about something a little bit deeper than that. If I have even the hair's breadth feeling that somebody's a charlatan, you know, or somebody's not living up to what they're meant to be espousing, it's almost like I break into a sweat. I can feel it. And I found that a lot in the New Age movement. I thought, and I ended up, later on I'd be able to put language to it, you know, and then realize, okay, this thing is just riddled with charlatans, even though there's some fantastic people within that movement. But the trouble was then that in my personal life, my personal destiny, the people that influenced me the most, personally I'm talking about now, so I can't speak for anybody else, turned out to be people who were not even remotely connected with the New Age movement, yet they were great sacred geometrists, or they were great you know, teachers or artists or poets or thinkers or writers or whatever. And then I started to realize that, wait a minute, there's this big promissory note over here, but all I'm really seeing is collectivism. You know, in the New Age movement, there's this collectivism, constant collectivism, ashrams, getting together, you know, hugging, and all this stuff that I'm not really not into. And then, as I said, this sort of core charlatanism, this label reading aspect, you know, and Socrates would have called it, you know, this idea that you talk to one guy and he thinks he's an expert on everything just because, okay, he specializes in making chairs, he's an expert on every other subject under the sun. So I would find this in that New Age movement, that there's a lot of people here, because they have a certain amount of knowledge about one thing, they now are like, you know, label readers, and they'll try to pretend to you that they really are experts on everything else. I find this sort of intellectual arrogance, and I have a meter for that. I don't like it. I don't like it in academic circles. When I grew up in Ireland with my dad and his people, and I didn't like it when I, you know, moved to America and was in the center of all of this. And one of, I think, the other reasons why I didn't like it, I guess that's it really, is because, well, I don't know, I sort of saw the schism or dichotomy, you know, between what people were saying and writing and the way their own lives were. Then, of course, I just got influenced by other people that were not even remotely connected to it. And I like that. I like that bohemian quality where these people weren't pretentious. They were just ordinary people, but they had extraordinary knowledge. So I started leaning more towards that, you know. But again, I would say that Edgar Cayce, you know, who's a great seer, great prophet, he might be one of the, you know, the foundations of it. Certainly, Reverend Paul Solomon, his organization was connected to the Wrekin Trust of England, which was run by Sir George Trevelyan, who was a personal friend of ours. He was another person we knew in our family, and a very lovely man, you know. And so, oh yeah, I remember what the other reason was. The other reason why I didn't really like it in the end of the day is I just didn't buy into their ideology. I literally didn't really buy into it. And don't forget that the New Age movement, even though it's founded in America, or it's sort of apparently Western, you must know, of course, that it's mostly based on Eastern philosophies, ultimately. In other words, the Eastern religions and Eastern practices very much infuse, as you well know, you know, the yogas, the meditation styles, the beads and the robes and the ash on the forehead and the mushrooms and the, all the palava and the namastes and all of this other garbage, it just seemed too packaged, too sort of Eastern, and I have huge problems with that. I haven't spoken on it a lot, but I have major problems with all forms of Eastern religion. I don't, maybe we don't have time to go into it, but I have serious problems with all forms of Oriental religions deeply. And so the New Age movement is knee deep in that. You only have to go into any New Age bookstore over there in America. You only have to hang around any of these loony cults. I won't go so far as to mention any names, but I was affiliated with many, many of them. And this kind of also was not something I was interested in.
We have a couple questions from the chat room. Guys, I'm writing everything down here, and we're going to get to them later in the broadcast. We are speaking with Michael Tsarion. His website is michaeltsarion.com and Architects of Control. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Truth Frequency. We are speaking with Michael Tsarion, and we were talking about Helena Blavatsky, the New Age movement, and how things came to be where they are. I mean, my personal views on everything is that the truth is not going to be packaged in one little book. You have to look everywhere and draw the truth out from every source that you come across. I mean, would you agree with that?
Of course. I mean, that's mythology teaches us this. The god of knowledge was Mercury, and he had the ability, he was the only god who had the ability to go between Hades and hell. All doors were open to him, all hallways. The gods and the goddesses would all have to accept Mercury. And that's a metaphor for the mind of man. There should be no place that he disallows himself to go, because ultimately the last frontiers of the world are mental, and all real change is also mental. And you're not going, you can't live in a one-season world. Nature won't allow it, and we're doing it, and that's why that's why we're experiencing all these meltdowns. That's why we're experiencing the kind of disenchantment that we're seeing right now, is because man wants to live mentally and psychologically in a one-season world, and that goes against, the ways of nature. It goes against his better nature, his inner nature. So yeah, when it comes to knowledge, people have to be prepared to have all the seasons and all the flavors in order to really find out what's going on.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me pose one of the questions from the chat room to you. Hold on, I've got them written down here. Somebody wants to know if you're doing any presentations in America.
Yeah, Brian Hall has actually invited me to speak at Conspiracy Con in June, so we'll be there. And that's about the only one I know is planned right now. There's several others in the works, but that one is the one I know about. Okay.
And do you have any comments on somebody named Freeman? I'm not sure who that is, but from the Freeman perspective, because I've heard Michael say a few disbarging. I can't read this what this guy wrote. Do you have anything to say about the Freeman perspective?
No.
No. Okay. I can't tell what he was trying to write in that question. All right. Back to Blavatsky. What else can you tell us about her?
Well, let me just mention that Brian Hall's website is conspiracycon.com. They can go there for more information on that. Conspiracycon.com, just in case they are interested. And what was the question again?
Well, if you have anything else to add about Blavatsky.
Well, I've got a few questions about Blavatsky. Did the British set her up to look like a fraud so that they could kind of steal her ideas, or because apparently whenever she and Olcott got together, while she was out of town, her own people set her up to make her look like a fraud.
Yeah, this has happened. This has happened a lot. This has happened with other people, like Osho, for instance. This has happened where they become either completely freaky and disassociated, or they actually do use a legitimate organization and then they bring it under their own power. Because remember, this particular Black Lodge is very sophisticated, but it also doesn't have a lot of power or time to be creating a lot of its own orders for the public. So what they might do, when they saw that Theosophy was catching on, and when they saw that it was attracting a lot of elites and a lot of intellectuals, and it was really ready to shake the world, they have multiple reasons of why they want to undermine it. Because these are, as I've said before, these royal figures, the ones at the top, they are actually the ones holding civilization back. The politicians, the people that we see, these royal figures, if we didn't have them, they're like the poison in the blood. They actually hold society back, and one of the ways that they've done this is by sabotaging legitimate people legitimate organizations that may start with the best motives, and then they get in there, you see, and try to subvert it. This is well known. They either try to do that through black propaganda, which is what you're talking about, or they'll literally do it by physically poisoning or taking out the leaders, which they've done. And they do this on all sorts of levels. And that's what I believe personally did happen to Theosophy. They realized that it was catching on, it was growing, you know, it was universal, it was ecumenical, and it was basically about self-discovery, self-development. It was about nothing more than that.
So they set up the Society for Psychical Research, which was a British group, and then they sent an investigator from the Society for Psychical Research in to find out if she was a fraud or not. And it was his first case, and he concluded, quote unquote, concluded that the Ascended Masters didn't exist and that the correspondence was fraudulent.
And then later had to take it back. Later on, by the way, he refuted this. He was shown to be a fraud, and his research, I think even he himself. I know the source is somewhere, and he had to actually refute this because other specialists came in from other groups and found that it was legitimate, and then they attacked him, and he actually on paper refuted it. He actually took it back.
Wow.
So, but of course that didn't get publicized. But yeah, you're right. And don't forget, we're talking about Blavatsky, and in context, I am no fan of any of these spiritualist movements that grew out of England at the time. I think they're highly spurious. I think they were controlled by the Fabian network. And although there's no real evidence of this, I believe that this Fabian network were deeply threatened by Blavatsky because she was on to them. And they didn't want that. They didn't want an order as powerful as hers was becoming to do this. And by the time that the book I'm talking about, Secret Doctrine Volume 3, came out, they knew that she was on to them. And people would read this book, and she was now starting to comment on these people and point out who they were. And of course, this then alerted them, I think.
Did she do that in the volumes 3 and 4 of the Secret Doctrine that were never published?
Yeah, I think that they're very hard to find. I have one, so but it's from an out of print.
Oh,
it's
wow.
a facsimile. It's not even the original. So trying to get the original of that book, I wouldn't even want to try to do that because it would probably be so expensive, even if it exists. I think years ago I actually found that it did exist, you know, but it was hundreds of dollars or something like that. And by the way, you can prove this. You just go onto Amazon, you type in Madame Blavatsky or whatever, and you'll find that all the books, or not all, but a good many of the books that actually defend Madame Blavatsky are either out of print or very, very expensive, where all the books that debunk her are the first ones that come up, and they're, you know, pretty much easy to get. And then second to that, I kind of mentioned this earlier, is that all the so-called critics never quote or comment from the books defending her. They write as if those books didn't exist. Now, see, I find that highly irregular. And most importantly, they don't refer to the comments that I have found that openly show that she was apolitical and she was very much against the power of the Vatican and also the Jesuit order, and that she understood that they were Illuminati-based. And people can find these quotes in my work, you see. And then if I find that others, so-called critics, are not even referring to this, but then calling her that she was herself Illuminati or that she herself was part of these organizations, that's a direct and blatant contradiction.
Wow. And do you think maybe another reason why the British set her up was because of the effect that she had on India and the she helped India in a way to take back their culture from the British?
Yeah.
So you
of
think
course.
it was partly political as well?
Yes, I would say so. I would say so.
Wow.
Because again, she was a person who wanted very deeply. This was one thing she wanted to do, which was create a kind of a mystery school setup, which would be completely ecumenical, where East meets West. And this, of course, went against the agenda of the ruling elites, who think that they're just the biggest honchos, and that the East is just full of a bunch of pygmies that they can push about. And therefore, they didn't want somebody from the occult world coming who's going to unite man, you know, in a religious or spiritual way. This is something they couldn't tolerate at all.
Wow. There's also a theory that the Theosophists communicated with these ascended masters through the use of astral projection. Is this true, or is this a fraudulent claim, or what was going on with that?
Well, I come from the Krishnamurti school, so we have no time for that at all. Whether it's even, I think it is true. I've read deeply on the subject, and I do believe that these forces, let's say, exist. And it is very possible for people in what is known as lower psychicism to be contacted by these beings. There's lots and lots of evidence for this. It's a well-known phenomena that when you start to open your mind, and we're not just talking about Blavatsky here, let's just keep general about spiritualism in general. And that is that when you start to open your mind, or as the Vedic people would say, when you start to work with the Kundalini or open the chakras or whatever, sort of vernacular you want to use. And this, by the way, this very much goes for those who think that taking ayahuasca and all these other things is also a backdoor into this. When you start to do this, I don't think that people have even the foggiest idea of the danger that they're in. I think was it you and I we spoke before about whether or not I support drug use or whatever it was. I think
yes.
Yeah. And I thought a lot about that. I usually try not to publicly even, make statements like that. And by the way, to the guy in the chat room who wanted to talk about Freeman, see, what the main reason why I don't is because I, of my own case, do not publicly speak about the work of other people. Whether I like those people or I don't, I never comment on the work of other people. All I do is suggest that people research what interests them, study it for themselves, and then come to their own conclusions. Because I get this email about 200 times a month, about what do you think of this guy, or what do you think about Bill Cooper, or what do you think about this, or what do you think about that. I've bent the rule a little bit when it's personal associates like Jordan Maxwell and other people of the past who are now dead and gone. But, it's not my job to be some sort of agony aunt or opinion maker. I'm not a journalist, and I'm not going to tell people, what I think of this person and that person, and load on them my own personal things. And this also goes for this topic as well. But I will say this, that I do believe that people have the absolute right to take drugs and go on these experiences and do what they want. But I will also say that they also need to realize that there's really great dangers. And I say this because I know how many people have been destroyed by doing this kind of thing. And it ties into your question. So when a person opens their minds, opens their psyche, and if people have read my Disciples of the Mysterium article, I go into this whole concept with extreme depth and talk about, neurotic behavior and various components of the ego. In very broad terms, I'd say that the Mysterium is a sort of a darker side of the ego, and again, we're keeping it very simple here. And therefore there are dangers. And when people have met these forces, and you can even meet them because of deprivation, people who've been locked up in cells or dungeons, people who've had food deprivation, people in the desert, there's all sorts of ways in which you can sort of enter into that world, of course. Trauma is one way. Listen to what Arizona Wilder, Kathy O'Brien have said. The elite know how to traumatize you to a certain extent, where your mind will also be, opened to these other sort of aspects of the self, the darker aspects of consciousness and what have you. And again, if we tie that into the fact that consciousness as we know it is extremely young and very fragile and vulnerable, this all makes sense. So then what happens when a person, for any number of reasons, tries to open their consciousness to something that is preternatural or even pan-dimensional or whatever you want to call it? I personally think there's real dangers in this. And then I also say that you don't need to. My philosophy is you don't need to do that because man is the highest of all things. He doesn't really need to be, sort of like some sort of a, Alibaba trying to find some open sesame, to some sort of arcane knowledge. It's already at his fingertips. There's other ways to attain this. And as I said, coming from the Krishnamurti school, we have no time at all for any of these distractions, be they internal or external, just in the same way that I don't support any external authority. Well, there's internal authorities as well. And what happens is when people have taken this road, when they belong to these societies that specialize in this kind of thing, they're going to meet these forces, and then they've been called angels, they've been called demons, they've been called daemons, they've been called archons. You see, you're into this whole realm, and I just think that it's very deadly, and there's been so much disaster and fallout. However, I will admit that, yeah, they exist. They're there. There's something there, although I take a Jungian standpoint and say I ultimately believe that these are aspects of consciousness. They're not so much objective realities any more than there's a red devil with horns running around somewhere, so I don't believe that. I believe they're subjective. I believe a lot of this is about aspects of the psyche that we don't understand. And if people read the Disciples of the Mysterium and watch the DVD that's coming out, they'll get more of an understanding of what I mean by that. Of course, that's arguable. A lot of people do believe these are actually objective entities or whatever, and of course we can all always argue that point,
That's really interesting that you said that. We recently had a shaman on who gave the complete opposite perspective. A couple of weeks down the line, we're going to have Pastor Tex Mars on to give us a Christian perspective, and that's why I love doing the radio show, because I get to hear so many different perspectives and put them all out on the table and let the audience really decide what works best for them.
Well, don't forget that I would include Christianity as a spiritualism. I believe that these people are disciples of the Mysterium. And I believe that the mind, through centuries and centuries and centuries of this kind of orientation, is extremely haunted in ways that we can't even imagine. What we're talking about now, these more obvious spiritualistic aspects, seeing forces, ascended masters, demonic forces, whatever you want to call it, those are just one subcategory or one sub-phenomena within a much larger theme or study of what can only be described as, mysteria. And I believe the philosophers have been haunted by it, the scientists are haunted by it, the religious people of the world are haunted by it, the whole world has it in various ways. In fact, you could almost point out to almost everything that a person is involved in is basically a form of possession. I think it was Jung who said that, look, we are not possessed by creative powers, they possess us. And I know he meant that in both positive and negative ways. And I know he was right. So I believe that, man, we know this when we see extreme versions of great artistic ability. When somebody plays a brilliant, who's a brilliant performer. And you'll even have performers like Alice Cooper who say, I went into an altered state. When I get on stage, I'm somebody else. And you'll even find this from classical musicians. Or you'll find that the Salvador Dali, Van Gogh types, these sort of mad artist types, who will say, they're switching their energy, or they feel that they're possessed by something. So there's a sort of it's a very fine line, because there's a certain euphoric, ecstatic experience, which is a very valuable part of human life. And you were talking about shamans earlier on, and even in the shamanic tradition, you have aspects like that, in which the shaman goes into an altered state of consciousness and this kind of thing. It's not something I personally am even remotely interested in, even though I've studied it. Because I believe that the reason of man needs to be pretty much used at all points. The vast majority of times in life.
This whole possession thing, though, isn't that a Luciferian belief system where they believe that they're being possessed by something? For instance, Jay-Z, he's got his alter ego on stage, and who was the other, the girl that he sings with? Beyonce, yeah, she's got her alter ego.
Yeah, she has Sasha Fierce. And she also is called the Queen Bee.
And if you look at some of their music videos, you see a lot of Masonic and Luciferian symbolism.
Yeah, that's part of the conference we're doing right now. I'm going into that in great depth. This Age of Manipulation conference I'm doing here in Europe is featuring very, very deeply into all of this. And I do know that's true about those people you've mentioned. Although when that kind of is a little bit different than what we've been talking about, the kind of alter egos that these people are experiencing, I believe, are the result of mind control.
And
the result, and the result that the fact that they are actually belong to satanic societies who have really messed with their minds. So again, it's a little bit slightly different. We're talking about independent people who may open up and have these sort of spiritualistic experiences. And again, the line can be kind of blurred if we don't know what we're talking about. In this particular situation, I totally believe that there's a hidden hand at work. In most of these celebrities that are like this, they are not in control at all of their imagery, their stage shows, their stage personas, the various symbolism at all. I think, I've proven to myself, and I hope to other people, that there are these worldwide satanic networks. I've talked about them for years. I'm one of the first people to even mention the kind of symbolism that they use in this particular way, why they draw upon the occultism. And then what we have to say, to answer your question, is that just because a certain society that is even evil, like these Luciferian satanic types we're mentioning, even though they draw upon occult symbolism and numerology and all that, does not mean, even in that situation, that those symbols and numbers and imagery is in itself negative. So we always have to, this is again a fine line, and I know a lot of people can't understand this. I know that Tex Mars doesn't understand it. I know that anybody who's not a Christian to these people is already, tantamount to like a lost soul. Mm-hmm. So I do not agree with that, even though I love the work that these people do. But you see, what I try to, what I bring to the table is that even if you're a Christian or you're from the Islam or wherever you might be from, and then you try to speak on this, you are, whether you like it or not, speaking about occultism. You are doing something that is occult. What I'd like to get through to the minds of people who are Christians is that Christianity is an occult religion, and that's what I've pointed out in so many works, and it's basically a fact. It's not separate from that. In fact, one could go so far as to say if you removed the entirely pagan elements from Christianity, and I mean even the Protestant version, there wouldn't be any religion left, and that is a fact. And then, as we said at the beginning of the show, they can often be compromised. I mean, their research, it's not that they're not well-meaning people, I know they are, but their research is perpetually compromised because of their partisan stance. And that leads you into a very serious conundrum. Because what would happen if the very people that you are pointing to as being the most evil, demonic, and suspect creatures on the face of this earth, and wherever they go, they spread disease and death. What happens if you're pointing at that group, but it then turns out that that very group, that very cabal, created your own religion?
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
We have to ask this question. I'm not making any point about it, but I'm just saying, we've got to take this on board. And if that is in fact the case, do you see how illegitimate that then becomes?
I think
and
religion...
that's the standpoint that I have. I believe that I welcome all tenets. I've said this umpteen times. I welcome all the divisions and legions and tents on the valley as we arm ourselves up to deal with the real enemy. I welcome it. I don't mind if you fly your own banner. I'm cool with that. But at the same time, if you try to territorialize it and then say we are the only ones it's only our swords that are going to deal with the enemy, and if there's infighting in the camp, then what do you need an enemy for? This is a simple strategy. You don't need to be Erwin Rommel to work this out. That obviously, if there's nothing but bickering and fighting over minutiae, and unfortunately it is these religious orgs who have done precisely this. They are absolutely guilty of it. And I would go even deeper, as I've done, and say, look, you might have to deal with your own house. You might have to deal with thinking about this. That could it be that the very people that with one hand you're pointing, you've now analyzed that there's an evil principality at work in the world. But my point to these people is, what would happen if you then found out that working in another way, these are the very forces who have created the very Judeo-Christian models, theosophy, teaching theologies, and so forth and so on. And that cannot be doubted, because in the Vatican is nothing but pagan symbols, Egyptian symbols, Atonist symbols, solar cult symbols, and it is absolutely no different in the Protestant religion. Nobody can deny that point.
And that's why they had to hijack theosophy. Because
it's one of the reasons.
Theosophy attempts to bring all religions together to try to flesh out what's true and what's not, and bring people to a higher understanding of spirituality. And they had to stop that.
Yes, but we shouldn't even use the word religion. Theosophy, by its definition, is anti-religious. She never meant, she had nothing but bad things to say about religion. She had nothing but revelations to speak about the Jews and their false appropriation of not only Kabbalah, which had nothing to do with them originally, their language, their alphabet. Blavatsky, now we're coming to the parts that I have always liked her for. Like I said, I'm not a theosophist. I don't buy into a lot of the Eastern traditions that she was interested in. They're not my cup of tea. But what is my cup of tea, and why I really still respect her, is because she had a lot to say about that. She had a lot to say, and that was very taboo. I mean, you're not going to be a scholar in the turn of the century pointing out to the Catholics and the Jews that very little of what they have is unique. For instance, the mithras, the mitre that the popes wear, that very word mitre comes from Mithra, or Mitra, which is the old solar god, you see, of the Persians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Kaaba, because this doesn't just go for Christians and Jews. The Kaaba is necessarily a black stone in which all the Muslims will circumambulate around. She points out that is purely zodiacal. The moving anti-clockwise around the black stone is to do with the constellations moving around the Saturn or the Sun or whatever what it is. And then she also found out, and it turned out that this was witnessed by an ancient historian called Maximus of Tyre. Maximus of Tyre, people can look him up. He was a famous traveler and historian. He actually said that he had seen the Arabians worshipping their god as a black stone. Thousands of years tradition he had witnessed before Islam was born. And there's many other instances of the idea of a black stone. The word Peter, which turns up in the Bible, you see, as a disciple. That was a term, Petra or Peter, was used centuries before by the Chaldeans to represent a man who interprets for the truth. We even find it in Egypt as Ta. Blavatsky pointed out that in India, in the books of India, the serpent race was known, of course, as Naga, but one of the other words that they used for the high serpent race was Sarpa, which turns up as the Jewish the cherubim and the seraphim, the flaming angels.
Wow.
So these terms actually come from the East. There's not a single element that wasn't plagiarized in earlier times from these pagan traditions. So this is what I mean when I say. And then how deeper can you go? I mean, how can it... Do you see how revolutionary it is to say that even these people's language, even these people's alphabet? I mean, you're going to the real core of something if you're saying that these people's very alphabet has been plagiarized. And then as time went by, as I remember I was saying earlier that some things get vindicated as time goes by, Blavatsky made these statements in the middle 1800s. Recently this has been now reconfirmed by Tony Bushby to say, yep, that the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet were actually the shadows cast by a crystal pyramid that was a capstone that could be placed on top of the Giza pyramid, or actually any pyramid for that matter. And when the sun was at a certain place, just like a prism, it would also cast certain squiggly shadows. And these shadows were always the same shape, and that the priests of Amun-Ra, who worshipped the sun, they would feel that those shadows were Amun-Ra, the sun, talking to them. These shadows that were cast were considered sacred. And therefore they wrote these squiggly lines down, and that became their hieratic writing. It's not the hieroglyphics. The hieroglyphics have been put in front of us as if that's the only language that the Egyptians had, which of course is absolute nonsense. You have to have a different kind of writing to be able to build a pyramid. And everyone is quizzed, oh, well, that's lost. That's the lost language of the Egyptians. No, it isn't. It's the language that's sitting right in front of you when you look at the 22 so-called Jewish or Hebrew script. That is the ancient, priestly, sacred writing of the Jews, of the Egyptians, the original Egyptian adepts, by the way, not even of the Egyptian people. This was the religious temple, what's called hieratic, meaning the priestly script that was then later appropriated. It came out with Akhenaten, you see, it came out with the Egyptian high adepts, and then it finally became Jewish when you really know what the word Jewish really represents. It's nothing to do with the Jewish religion, it has to do with the Judites and the very powerful elites that left Egypt with Akhenaten. This has been confirmed in the last 5-10 years. But Blavatsky was already talking about it. Valentine Straighton was talking about it, another author from the 1800s. Norman Lockyer, the great astronomer and expert on temple design that I refer to in my astrotheology book, also mentioned that the Hebrew language, the Hebrew letters, were Egyptian. And if people read my astrotheology book, all the evidence is in there, all these quotes and sources are put there. Yeah, Blavatsky was saying this years ago. So by looking at these pagan elements, then obviously it's a little bit dodgy to then say that just because you've now repackaged yourselves, you're now pointing at all of these so-called other groups and telling the world that they're Luciferian, they're evil, they're demonic, when your own order is subterraneanly connected. And so this is the major issue. Now, I'm talking more there about the institutionalization of religion. I'm not commenting on individual people's personal spiritual beliefs. You see, that's nobody's business but a person's own beliefs. What I confine my critiques to is the institutionalization of this, which anybody can study, and many Christians like Tex Mars and Eustace Mullins and G. Edward Griffin and also Dr. Wardner, many Christians have gone into this. It's just I hope that with time they'll even go deeper and see more things that they are not really aware of right now.
So Blavatsky was basically attempting to pull back the curtain of the doctrinal secrecy and the contemporary religious institutions of the day, and that was one of the main problems that they saw with her.
And she, by doing that, remember, and doing it in that way, she came up directly to confront then
Wow.
The highest powers. I mean, the Templars, the ones who are really at the top of the ladder. I have a quote, by the way, from her first books, Isis Unveiled. Can I read it?
Yeah, sure.
She says that most of the bodies, such as the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, the Rite of Avignon, this is a place in France, the Order of the Temple, are nearly all the offspring of the sons of Ignatius Loyola. Okay, today we've got the, Eric John Phelps, and we've got all these people talking about the Jesuits and it's mighty wonderful and it's hard to take and oh my goodness, how are we going to get around all of this? 100 years ago, she had already put her, thumbnail right on the problem, talking about the Orient, the Grand Orient Lodges, the Knights Templars, these French rites, the Scottish Rite. And people damn well know that the top of the Scottish Rite, that's why it's called Scottish, is because it directly links to the Knights Templar. Then the Scottish Rite is very akin to the Shriners, who are some of the most powerful secret orders in Masonry. Very high degree. And of course they involve royalty, because my goodness, when Scottish Rite was created, it was over the differences between the royalty in England. And the royal figures were the ones doing the divisions. It wasn't ordinary punks from the street. It was the dukes and the kings and the princes of England and France. It was these Templars, these ex-Merovingian people who had moved into England during the Norman conquests and before. And these very same Templars are the people who originated the white slavery movement, originated the opium dealing, created the British East India and Dutch East India companies, were dealing in slavery, in child abduction, child sacrifice, murder. And people are wondering about Blavatsky and her peccadillos? My God, you want to debunk something? I'll give you plenty of homework to do.
Wow. I mean, yeah, they try to say that she would do anything for fame, but upon her arrival in New York City, she said, "I am here in this country sent by my lodge on behalf of truth and modern spiritualism. It is my most sacred duty to unveil what it is and expose what it is not. Perhaps did I arrive here 100 years too soon? Maybe. And I'm afraid it is so, for people seem to care less every day for truth and every hour more for gold. My feeble protests and endeavors will be to no avail. Nevertheless, I am ever ready for the grand battle and perfectly prepared to bear any consequences that may fall to my lot." I think that quote would effectively prove right there that this woman wasn't a deceiver or a witch or a member of these secret societies or anything like that. She was a quintessential guru.
Right, she was, and also you see she was an insider. So of course, yes, you may not like the fact that she created her own order or whatever it might be, but I always have respect for these insiders because I know their value. As a researcher, I know their value. But I've got a quote here from The Secret Doctrine, Volume 3. It's one I didn't use in the book, but it's an extra one that I have. She said, "Had the keys to the hieratic writings," this is the priestly writings, the esoteric writings, she said, "had the keys of the hieratic writing and the secret Egyptian and Hindu symbolism been known to the Christian fathers, they would have not allowed a single monument of old to stand unmutilated."
Wow.
So she is talking about the real destroyers of gnosis and wisdom. Her little order was just a way to try and bring it back and preserve it. In fact, the hurriedness with which she wrote Isis Unveiled, and the fact that there was a lack of sources, which is, not particularly a good thing. You'd wish that a lot more things were sourced, even though you should go with what is said and do the research yourself. But the hurriedness was because she was desperate. She was really desperate to try and preserve. And this is when she traveled. Where is she traveling? Every place she's going to is in ruins. Churches are going up and temples are being destroyed. When she gets over to India, it's in ravages. When she gets over to Tibet, even the modern monks have forgotten how to create the herbs and translate the books. You see, so she was very, very cognizant of the fact that this knowledge
was being destroyed.
Was being lost day by day.
Wow. And
so she set herself tirelessly to work, very much in the same way that the great Thomas Taylor did, in order to transcribe the works of Aristotle and Plato, into English. So people have done this, and they've done it in abject poverty.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's very easy. It's very easy, see, for other people to come along and go, well, we got problems with this. Well, who the hell are you? What have you done to preserve ancient wisdom and ancient knowledge? What have you done to fight evil? And she fought it in her own way, and I believe that's why I have respect for her. Even though I don't agree with so many things, I have respect for her because she was a champion of truth. She was a person who definitely tried to fight evil. It doesn't mean that she was academically correct. It doesn't mean that I believe in all of her philosophies. It doesn't mean that I'm going to say for people to become theosophists or anything like that. Yeah. But a person who's going to have quotes like I just read, and you did, going to the heart of the matter, pointing out that all the traditions of Christianity and Judaism come from these other cults, like I said, the cult of Mithras. I mean, the cult of Mithras, right, for instance, they held the eagle. I mean, check this out. They had the owl, they had the eagle, and they had the hawks. These were actually titles that they used for their various priests. They referred to Mithras himself as the son of the sun. They referred to their ministers as children of the sun, or soldiers of Mithras, you see. And the lion and the eagle and the hawk. These are symbols that you find on so many corporate advertisements. You find it on architecture. You find it on money. You find it on the medals. You find it on the royal heraldry. All these Merovingian, Templar, royal families. You find these very Mithraic symbols. Like I said, the Mithras, the crown, is even being used. She found out that, for instance, it was on a Gnostic papyrus that actually came out of Egypt, and that was dated from about the 2nd or 3rd century. There was a quotation on it, and it arrived in England, and it was translated, and the quote said, "This is not wine, this is the blood of Osiris." And it had a picture of like a carving of a piece of bread, and it said, "This is not bread, this is the body of Osiris." Right? Over the gates of the temple of Dendera, it actually said, "Come unto me, all ye who are like heavy laden, and I'll give thee rest." I went into all of this in the astrotheology DVD I did. So you can barely find a name, you can barely find a story, like the raising of Lazarus, or the walking on the water, or the marriage of Cana. All the things that, Christians take at face value and never even question, or even have a very sketchy idea of what it was, is all rooted in either astrotheology, sidereal mythology, some form of cosmology of the ancient world. And we're still doing catch-up on that. We're still trying to deal with that. And then I go further and say, look, half of these people that run the religious institutions of the world, and certainly the royalist orgs, are the very parasites that are keeping man in a state of total arrested development on all levels, not just socially, politically, and so on. And then what they do is they offer you a bunch of superficial benefits to incarcerate your to decorate your incarceration, to give us this idea, this veneer that we're actually very civilized. And that's what Aldous Huxley's talking about, and it's going to become pharmacological tomorrow. It already is. Mm-hmm. They say that the usage of drugs in England have risen by 400% in recent years. They're now even legalizing certain other kinds of drugs, because they ultimately know that we're in a situation of complete psychological meltdown. One of the things that happens when this takes place is that people then, what they do is there's a psychological word, which is sublimation or compensation, in which you then say, you start worrying about other forms of meltdown, like social, economic, climate, etc. Because there's a penchant in the human mind that refuses to do inner homework. It refuses to realize that the root of all problems is psychological. And just when there is about to be what you might want to call an apocalypse or a great change, a sea change, it's very common that the human mind, not just individually, but collectively, projects it outwards. And I've been seeing this now for many, many years. And therefore you have all these scares and all this external meltdowns. And it's because the psyche of man enjoys that. Because that's the escape route. If you can point to continually external things being the reason, right, for decay, and the reason for social chaos or whatever, that's brilliant. Because now you don't actually have to take true responsibility. And man has done this aeon after aeon after aeon. He always finds a way out of taking personal responsibility. And now we're in this age of awakening. Astrologically, we're in the age of Pluto. There's a lot to do with Shiva-like energy and so forth and so on. And this is where people now have a chance again to really understand what are the root causes of all forms of tyranny. And if they don't do that, then they're going to buy into every little, bugbear, every kind of homunculus behind the curtain, every shadow that can be thrown up, and every kind of excuse. And then with another part of their mind, because that's a lie, by doing that you're in a lie mechanism, you'll not feel comfortable with that lie, and so you'll build up even more anxiety. And then in come the big pharma, and all of these other methodologies to say, okay, we know what you can do with that. Lose yourself in TV, lose yourself in work, lose yourself in gurus and cults, and lose yourself in drugs and drink and all these other things you see that they hope will take care of it, or lose yourself in some sort of political activity.
The great distraction. Yeah, the great distraction, absolutely. I mean, that's the reason why I wanted to do this show, because it seemed like a distraction to keep people from looking into Helena Blavatsky's work, saying, hey, don't look at this. This is evil. This is satanic. Don't look at it. But when I opened it up, I realized, wow, wait a minute. There's a whole lot of truth here. Let me go to the caller lines real quick. We've had a caller holding since the beginning of the broadcast, and I want to give him an opportunity to pose his question. Will, you're on the air.
Hey, Chris, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're on with Michael.
Hey, Mike, big fan. Love all your work. Fantastic. I've been recently reading Wilhelm Reich, character analysis, sexuality and anxiety. In regard to sexual gratification, from the Wilhelm Reich perspective, he says that it is pretty much the final key issue to curing neurosis, but it is very difficult to gratify oneself. And he believes in pornography and all that being open, and I concur with that. But what would you recommend in the case of, since I wrote Soul Proliferate with so many neurotics, excluding the organ therapy, to curing neurosis without having relations with other neurotics?
Interesting question. Thank you for the call.
Well, I hope I got the question right. He's asking me what do I recommend other than orgone teachings within a sort of a Reichian context that might help with neurosis and things like that?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you see, here we're into an area that is really a very, very important topic for me. And I think there also has to be great caution with any kind of roadmap. What I mean by that is that it's important that people do not try to get into an A to Z type of way, like somebody setting themselves up as an expert to tell another person what that will entail. This is, I think, been one of the problems of the past, and I don't think it's right. If we were to just talk, sort of loosely, I might say, as I've done on various occasions, oh, you should get into the work of, Alexander Lowen and look into bioenergetics, or, hey, why don't you, go over and read Arno Gruen or R.D. Laing, And of course we can reference, and I try to do that in my professional work on the blog, forum, and in the sources, and I don't mind doing that to a certain extent by saying, oh, you have an interest here? Check out this, or check out some more of Wilhelm Reich's lesser-known works like Listen, Little Man, or The Mass Psychology of, Fascism, or whatever, and continuing the studies. But when it comes to individuals asking seeking personal advice, I'm against that. I'm not picking you out, per se here. We're just talking, so I'm not singling you out or anything like that. I am just a person who really strongly believes that each individual must make that journey on their own. Mm-hmm. They must find out what works for them, because I'm extremely against any kind of sort of A to Z kind of mapping, so in other words, you might take a piece from somebody else that you say, hey, that worked for them, or they recommend it, but I'm very much against that in a way, because it's very, very collectivist, and therefore I'm not a collectivist, so therefore it must be that you must find your own unique way, because remember, the way out of neurosis, first of all, is to see it as neurosis. I've always spoken about deconstruction. In order to solve the problem, you must get all the false things out of the way. In order to see the self, which is in fact you can't see it until you're first familiar with all the things that are not the self. You've got to study the mind in totality, and that might lead you then into Jungianism, or into Freudianism, or even into Blavatsky, or into occultism, or into Wilhelm Reich, or goodness knows where it will lead. You see, and that person then, it's the road that they're traveling is absolutely unique and independent. I can't insist upon this more, because it actually has a very strong metaphysical basis, because as a matter of fact, when you finally arrive at your so-called solution or revelation, it is not so much the ending and the gaining of the insight at the end that is important. In fact, you might even go so far as to say that the ending that you arrive at is entirely based on the steps that you've taken to get to that road. And this is what I always try to make clear, because we are so goal-oriented. We drag all our bad behavior and all our bad lessons into this world of psychological development, and also into the world of the occult. I like what Erich Fromm said. Erich Fromm talked about mutability and doing basically what I'm saying, which is carve your own road out, because in fact the goal at which you arrive will be based on those 360 steps you took as you travel through the cycle, you see. So the ending is in the journey. And therefore, if the journey is in some way illegitimate or inauthentic or collectivist or whatever language you want to use, you see that in the end will create another form of neurosis. Because the way things are in the world and the way the mind works is the mind is a very bizarre thing. It's like you try to throw a net, to use a metaphor, you try to throw a net over the mind to try and solve one of its problems, or rope it in, or say, I've got a piece of it now. And do you know what happens? Like some weird, chameleon circuit, the mind becomes the net you've thrown on it. This thing is really the trickster, you see. So in a way, we've got to be very careful. And therefore, this serpentine mind that we have is pretty ambivalent. It's a very amazing adversary in one way. And therefore, one of the things I've isolated that causes a lot of problems is this collectivism. And when you go to a teacher who's written a book or has a particular ideology or philosophy, there's a tendency to not realize that teacher, and remember, a lot of these teachers may not even say what I'm saying, and therefore you adopt their theories or you adopt their philosophies because it's, again, a part of the mind that needs handrails. Your interest in that subject might be, and again, I'm not singling you out or anything like that, I'm just saying that a person's interest in a particular study might be based on the fact that they're inwardly weak, that they're inwardly scared of taking the journey themselves. And therefore, I'm worried then that the step that a person takes, you see, will lead them to another form of neurosis, because it's like Chinese dolls. You may escape from one level of neurosis only to inherit another, even more pernicious form, you see. In other words, another metaphor is that we might strangle ourselves in the very web we're trying to release ourselves from. By every motion that you make, you can further entrap yourself. So the way to get out of it is actually quite difficult. And ultimately, in the movie Dune, for instance, at the end, when they're really trying to negotiate the desert at the end, and they're in deadly peril, Frank Herbert gives you a piece of monumentally important information. And the character says to his mother, walk without rhythm, so you won't alert the worm. Now this contains, like many of these movies do, and people don't even notice it, an incredibly important piece of information. Walking without rhythm means walk with no pattern, walk with no accepted school. And of course, as I said before, I come from the Krishnamurti teachings, and they say, carve your own path out. Now, if on that road of discovery, you need to end up reading, I don't care what it is, Anton Blinken LaVey, if it comes to that. I don't know where that journey's going to take you. Neither do you. That's the beauty. You put your faith in your higher self, and you go along the journey wherever it's going to take you. And that will make of you what you are. The sword has to go through the fire. There are no shortcuts. And there will be many guides, and there will be many deceivers. And there's no way really to stop that from happening, because we're dealing here ultimately with our own minds. And therefore everything we learn from everybody else, every other teacher we may admire, is ultimately a reflection of something about ourselves. We wouldn't even be coming to that person. We wouldn't even be interested in that doctrine unless something within ourselves was leading us there. It's almost like, are you playing the guitar, or is the guitar playing you? Is the music playing you, or are you playing it? And as you go very deeply into this journey, sometimes those lines become very ambivalent, because there is a higher self. I do believe there is a higher self, and that higher self guides us. And therefore, in our world today, there's been so much institutionalization and territorialization of knowledge. And I think this is the problem. So indirectly it answers your question, because the first thing to do is see that there is a neurosis. And the way out of it is to study that neurosis. Study all those forms of anti-truth. Study all those forms of pseudo-love. Study all those forms of pseudo-reality until you're almost sick of it. Until you're so familiar with it, like a forensic detective hunting some maniac. Right? That serial killer, that creep, looks out his window, and there in the pissing rain, there he is. There he is, Popeye Doyle. eating his burger, looking up at your window in howling storms. He's awake. You got to become like that. You got to become like that. You got to be on the trail of the predator from morning till night, every waking moment. Let nothing else be more important. Nothing. Become completely. First of all, don't follow the tiger thinking it's going to lead you out of the woods. And secondly, become absolutely up to speed on the nature of your predator or the nature of that which you're seeking. Become completely knowledgeable about it. This goes in wartime. We know that the generals had the picture of their adversary right on their desks or right on the wall above them. We know that the greatest detectives have the minds of criminals. Why is that? Because it's almost like a yin-yang thing. You're going to end up having to become so knowledgeable about your adversary in order to unlock the secret or find out why this thing came into being in the first place. I've said it in other works in different ways in which I said you have to embrace the shadow. This is what I mean by doing shadow work. Instead of projecting a face of fear into the unconscious, you project something different because you're going to meet in reality or you're going to meet in your psyche exactly the kind of consciousness that you project into it. This is the way that mysteries are. And therefore the person who enters into any kind of mystery, be it inward mystery or not external mystery, everything they do on that journey is going to be predicated upon the kind of intent that they have. Intention is absolutely everything. And that is what it's all about. So if you then have a complete sense of determination and also optimism and the right kind of attitude, then amazing things will come to you. But the mind tricks us into wanting those revelations to be collective in some way. Oh, I've had this wonderful experience, now I'm going to write about it and share it with the world. Or, is this experience I'm having, can my girlfriend get it too? You know, we're already packaging it. Do you know how rare it is in this world to have a personal experience or relationship with something? One-to-one, just yourself alone, without being contaminated by what mommy and daddy and everybody else, you know. So everybody is everyone. We even have billboards now talking about this collective claptrap. The social hive is becoming almost ubiquitous. It's almost like there's nothing personal anymore. But you see, the thing that we love about the beautiful creations of the Wilhelm Reichs and the Ezra Pounds and the Rilkes and the musicians is that it's completely unique. You wouldn't have had that thing without them doing it. That's what makes a Segovia attractive or a particular artist, you see, that we like their work or whatever. And we even talk about filmmakers having a certain style. So that's what I'm talking about. It's really not that esoteric. It's like, what is your own style? What is your own flavor? What is your own understanding? Every institution in the world is working on the mind of the child to condition it to think like other people and to have everything secondhand and everything borrowed. So on your journey, you might find that it's Wilhelm Reich is your guide, you know, or Ayn Rand or whoever. And therefore, that's part of your treasure trove. That's part of your interest. And whether or not other people get it or not, or whether other people are into it or not, really should be of a much, much lesser concern. So that's basically the only thing I can say about that.
Amazingly said. Amazingly said. Caller, any more questions?
No, that was perfect. Thanks for saying that.
All right.
I actually like Ayn Rand, too.
Excellent.
Okay, thanks.
You have a great day.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. It was a good one.
Very good, very good. Let's go to a quick break, and we'll be right back with Michael Tsarion. Now, Michael, you know, the network has given us an unlimited time, literally, so you just tell us whenever you're ready to wrap it up. I have all the time in the world, so you just let me know. I do have a question from the chat room for you. Is Blavatsky's work available unedited, or is what we see now, is it watered down?
I think what you can get right now is pretty okay. You know, I mean, the books that I got, I found what I wanted to find.
Okay.
And, of course, don't forget that there is a Theosophical Library over in London. And then also with the Internet, you know, of course, we have to realize there is multiple translations of everybody's work. So that always needs to be sort of borne in mind. But I would say that what you get is pretty good. People can check out G.R.S. Mead, M-E-A-D. He was her secretary, and he's probably one of the best authorities on Blavatsky. Again, a very clear and distinct writer, himself an expert on Hermetic teachings. And there are books out. And again, go ahead and read the books that, you know, criticize her and find out for yourselves. As I said, it's a mark of genius in a way to be contradictory. And I think that we've forgotten that. A lot of the people today have really, really forgotten this. They sort of expect this kind of perfection, in people. I get this a lot in my work, I mean, I didn't know how to write a book when I wrote a book. And I didn't even think I was going to have to write one. You're not suddenly just an expert in the English language or any of these things, You're not an expert. Did I know that, years ago that you've got to source everything? No, you learn these things as you go, and you try to get better and better and better. And also then you find out that people who are thinkers, people who are really alive in their minds, will have these ambivalent personalities. They will be contradictory, and we have to handle that. We have to find our way through. It just comes with the territory. And to set yourself up and to critique people just because of that is very, very limited and prejudicial.
One of the things people seem to critique her about the most, though, are the seances. Was this true? And how does that tie into tarot and other esoteric knowledge like that?
Well, that part I don't know anything about, because I'm myself not interested in any of that. So I have never even really read up or studied the mediumistic work, which is mostly the bulk of what books are written on about her, about these various, spiritualistic kind of things that they were interested in, or the ascended master concept, all of that. I've got my own take on it, but I'm not interested in it, and I haven't read those anecdotes, so I really couldn't say anything about that, actually. I myself, again, always approach divination from a very scholastic point of view. I think that there's enough mysteries in the tarot and in astrology and in Kabbalah and numerology and these things that can be studied by anyone. Because I believe that these devices, these arts, are basically to help you develop these extrasensory levels of your being. And they also offer you the protection to do as well, so that you don't get, compromised spiritually or whatever. And that your beginnings, I believe these things can be used by the layman. You see, my philosophy is that you don't already need to be clairvoyant or sensitive. These things can be used in the most practical aspects of your life, and then you work from there. Again, remember, as I was saying, in that very individualistic way, in which then you let that teaching take you where it needs to go. It's you're doing the walking, you're doing the controlling. And therefore, if neurosis or psychic breakdown happens to occur to you, then to be blunt about it, you're to blame. What the institutions of the world have done, and what Christianity makes a lot of hay out of, is that anyone who happens to be interested in anything, the occult, I mean, you see the mainstream television in America is full of this. Hideous stories that just because some kid was wearing a Marilyn Manson t-shirt or something, and goodness knows if that kid should ever be involved in anything criminal or semi-criminal, now, the music and the occultism gets the blame. And so parents are obviously people who do this. Society does this, in which even if they can find a single occult connection, even the most meager one, then that gets the blame for every other kind of defect that actually originates with the broken society and the broken parents and the broken schools and all the rest of it. Society is hell-bent to never accept it, and so all forms of occultism, both the positive and the negative aspects of it, they get the blame. What I was talking about is that when you go on the journey with the divination arts or I Ching or whatever it is, and say that you have an interest in this thing, not all people, Chris, are good people. And the vast majority of people who get into occultism are particularly not good people. Again, this is just coming from me, so it's a personal, I can only speak from my own personal experience. So if then madness or some sort of neurosis or even criminal activity takes place, don't be blaming the occultism. Blame the person. Look at what they did. Who are these people? What did they get into this for? We have this sort of, are we that clueless to think that everybody starts in the same trap? Like a dog race? Everybody starts on the same line, at the same hurdle, and then after the gun is fired, they're all going to stay in a sort of uniform way? People do not start as uniform people. There's people who get into these subjects who are very, very spiritual and bright souls and intelligent and moral, And then there are deeply, deeply immoral people who are interested in this because they want power over people, they want to have sexual power, or they want to have other kinds of things that attract them. And therefore, if that person then meets demons, so to speak, are we really going to say, are we going to still be so primitive as to say, oh, the tarot is evil, astrology is evil? Hang on a minute. That just does not add up at all.
Well, that's amazing that you mentioned that, because that's what I tell people all the time, and I'm starting to wonder, does the Illuminati really have the truth? And if so, it's not the truth that makes them evil, it's what they do with it.
Well, that's a brilliant question, but so let's go like this. Let's take it like this. We might answer the question by saying, is there really a truth? Because that also could be the problem there. Is there really a truth, or is there only individual people's truth? You see, this is what we have to handle. If you were to ask me, I would say each person's truth is the truth. And of course, immediately when you say that, we will notice that there's a dark side to that statement, because oh wow, it's very good to say it, because on the positive side is that everybody should walk their own path, everybody should come up with their own conclusions, everybody has the freedom to understand what is the truth, for themselves. The downside of that is that then that is tantamount to also saying, then I can do what I want to do. Mm-hmm. My truth leads me to believe that I can just, walk on other people, abuse the world, nothing matters. Ultimately, there's no ultimate reality. So I just live in a sociopathic way in which I just do whatever I feel like. Because in fact, that is the case, isn't it? If you go and interview any sociopath, they will always mitigate their behavior by saying, that's what I believed at the time, okay? I just do what I want to do. I don't believe in anybody else. I don't trust nobody but myself. You'll always find this.
Absolutely.
So this is again, fine line. It's a problem. Okay, take the opposite. Say I put a new hat on and go, no, there is only one ultimate spiritual truth. That is, again, has a very, very beautiful side to it. Because that will, then if you believe that, then you go, oh, I'm so glad to hear that, because I needed that. As a human being, I want to know that there's a higher purpose for everything. Somebody's told me that there's a higher truth. I really believe that, and now I'm going to seek for it. I'm going to look at religion. I'm going to look at atheism. I'm going to look at theosophy. I'm going to walk the earth. I'm going to learn about nature. I'm going to look into things, because there's this higher truth that all religions have spoken about, and you're going to go on that journey. However, there is also the dark side. Again, what's the dark side? The dark side of that is that some institution can come along and say, we are the only ones who have access to that higher truth. Well, we didn't make it, but we are its ministers. And therefore now we have to subjugate you, we have to collectivize you, you have to do as we say, and the truth is not necessarily in your keeping. And we know this has in fact happened, because every religious institution tells you this, and every Masonic type institution tells you this. They work entirely on the promissory note, that if you do as we say, tomorrow you will have this amount of knowledge, this level of arcane. And I'm not even going into whether or not this knowledge exists. I'm just pointing out the fact is there's a promissory level. And then you could subdivide that again. If a Mason was here with us, he'd say, but don't you understand, the reason why we do that is because we want to purify man. We don't want man, the ugly, contaminated person from the street with all of their prejudices and lunacy and disrespect, to gain the kind of knowledge that we want. No institution does this, no school will allow it, no business will allow it, and you have to give them that. You go, yeah, you're right, you're quite right. In fact, I've said it myself on many occasions that, perhaps the impure person shouldn't have any, shouldn't or won't be able to gain knowledge. So in everything that you look at, you have this ambivalence. And this is what a lot of fundamentalist type people can't deal with. They cannot deal with that with, number one, reality is changing every minute. They can't deal with the fact that you have to think in terms of dialectics, opposites. If you hold a truth here, think about its opposite. If people could do this, there'd be no war, there'd be no destruction, because you'd already in your own mind be conceiving of what the antithesis is to the positions that you hold. And I always have said, and I'll say it again, I'll frame it again by saying, and that is not a collective action. If you hold, if you're able to have an opinion over here, and then you also create a kind of meditative state in which you're able, intellectual state, to conceive of its opposite. In that juggling act, in that weighing and balancing act, I mean, it happens in every single courtroom. It actually does go on in the mind continually anyway. What I'm describing is not esoteric. This actually does happen on a certain degree in the mind. But whatever changes will happen are going to happen individually for you. In some instances, you might have to give up an opinion, because by thinking about its opposite, you may go, you know something, I was wrong. So now I go with the antithesis. I accept that the opposite point of view is actually the more correct. This is what Socrates advised people to do. It's what all rational people should be doing. In many other instances, you'll say, oh, I've weighed up the opposites. And no, I think they're false. I'm going to continue holding to this idea that I had originally. You see? But that is going to be an activity of absolutely nomothetic. It's going to be absolutely unique to you. It's not going to be reproducible by the next person, you see? And maybe it's the same thing with truth. Truth is, to me, I can never get away from thinking, you see, that truth is ultimately available to us when we are absolutely so aware of what is the false. And that is what's called apophatic learning, negation.
Can you spell that again for us? Apophatic?
Yeah, apophatic, A-P-O-P-H-A-T-I-C.
And it's basically being able to argue with yourself over what's real and what's not without having to go to other people.
No, you go to other people, but apophatic is basically breaking down, deconstruction. It's like forensics. It's like Sherlock Holmes. It's like what detectives do all the time. You sift through the information and you exclude whatever is impossible. And like Conan Doyle said in one of his books, once you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. And that's what I mean. And there's various ways of doing this, but I don't believe there's any collective way of doing it. So in my mind, and I don't think I've ever been able to get past this myself, as soon as an institutionalized press release is released, you know, that we have the truth, I'm already suspect then. If I see the us, the our, the we, in any kind of proximity to truth or speaking of truth, I'm already out of there. Because I really do believe that we are individuals. Our self is not the same type of self as everybody, even though we completely been mind controlled by the consensus people to believe this. I believe we're here absolutely for unique purposes, and therefore I believe our grasp of what is true, you know, there's probably better words in other languages for this, but what is absolutely sustainable is absolutely unique to us. That doesn't mean that later on, after you've found your unique truth, that some other people might share it or come to a similar. That's probably bound to happen, but it's irrelevant. Ultimately, philosophically, it's irrelevant. What truth you come to is yours, and therefore that is the way that you have arranged your reality. You remember sort of close to the end of the movie The Wall, when the pink character has smashed the hell out of his hotel room. I mean, he's just destroyed everything. He shaves off his eyebrows, he shaves off his hair, he just destroys, he smashes everything that he owns. It's a metaphor for going through total underworld experience, total chaos. He almost commits suicide. But the movie doesn't leave you with that, you know, nihilistic ending. What you then see him do later on is he takes every single piece of everything he broke and he arranges it in a new mandala. It's actually in the movie, you can watch it. He takes everything that he broke and he rearranges it in a new pattern. This is very Zen, this is very Taoist, because in fact, in one lesson that the Taoists had, the Zen masters used to teach their disciples about perfection, very much the truth, what we're talking about. What is it? And they would have this particular lesson for the monks, for the people who were trying to gain enlightenment. And the master would say to the disciples, I'm going to hold up, what would happen actually physically is they would take them to the pottery area. And the lesson was that you had to make the perfect bowl. And that's all the master would say. In order to pass this particular lesson, or this rite, this part of the ritual, you have to create the perfect bowl. And we don't care how long it takes you or what happens, but, you know. And so the pupils would go off and they'd try to make this perfect bowl out of the clay. And then they'd bring it to the master. And of course, you know, he'd be dismissing one after the other, going, okay, good, yeah, right, move on. Not perfect. Until basically every single pupil had not gained the perfection. And so finally, one of the disgruntled, pupils go, hey, what the hell is this, I mean, we got, 300 students here, and, you keep on telling us it's not the perfect one, then you make it. And so the teacher in the story lifted one of the bowls and held it upright, and then in a split second, he dropped it as if by accident, and it smashed on the floor into like hundreds of pieces. And he asked one of the students to sweep up all the pieces and take it over to another part of the school where the gold masters were, where they made the jewelry or where they melted gold, right? And he said, ask the goldsmith to glue all the pieces back together for us and use gold to do it. After a couple of hours or days, whatever, the bowl returns and the master holds it up in front of the class and goes, here is the perfect bowl. Because it embodies not only creation, which is what you all guys were doing, it also embodies destruction. As your breath does, as the creation does, as nature does.
So it has the
So in
balance,
other words,
the balance of both.
The balance of both. And in the Western world, and maybe even for hundreds and hundreds of years, we have lost this. We understand it intellectually, perhaps. And I'm not including everybody. I'm not making a general statement here. But on the whole, we are a very acquisitive people. We've been mind-controlled into something that's actually quite destructive. The destruction we're going towards is the destructiveness of complete yang mentality, complete acquisition. And I mean that even in a psychological way. We've lost the ability to be feminine. We've lost the ability to understand this deconstructive principle in life. And yet, that happens in our lives all the time. So half the neurosis that you see, half the psychological and emotional meltdown from children to husbands and wives, when somebody leaves, when somebody dies, when a job is lost, when fame passes you by, when material wealth is lost, you see, whatever it might be, a great sportsman being eclipsed by other younger guys, or a beautiful model saying, oh yeah, they don't want to know me now, whatever it might be, all that fallout and depression and chaos and anxiety and frustration is born out of the fact that we cannot handle this flow, this yin and yang, this idea that your time comes and then it moves on, do something else, change. There's a movement, there's a rhythm in life. And we have lost this ability because we always fixed. It's the same thing for science. This goes into lots of different areas. And so we've forgotten how to make that perfect bowl. We've forgotten how to come into a relationship with this deconstruction. And yet, as I said, all around us, that force exists. That force is not going to stop. It's going to be in our lives. It's happening every day. Millions of cells in our bodies die. People do leave. Change will occur. So if we don't fall in love with that change and work with it, then we remain static. And unfortunately, nature does not permit anything to be static. And if you continue to be static, if you absolutely go too far with that model, then nature arranges it so that forces will come in that we might then erroneously label destructive, when in fact those are the agents of greater healing. And in fact, that's why sanity and sanitize, I've always said, are very connected. Because forces that we now, in this age, in this world right now, think are destructive, are actually not destructive. We are destructive. Our thinking has become destructive. Our thinking has become anti-life, pseudo-love, pseudo-life, pseudo-reality. And therefore, the other forces that are really living and vital, that take care of all the universe, the stars, the leaves, the trees, the water, that cycle is in perfect unison and balance. And it's going to make sure that we also fall into balance.
Amazing.
Now, this principle is existing, and it exists in our bodies. So as I said earlier on, it ties into the fact that if a person meets psychosis, or if they meet a type of breakdown, in a much broader context, you also have to look at why that is. Maybe that person has not dealt with their impurities. Maybe that person hasn't got a clear grasp of reality. Maybe that person is on this journey for wrong reasons. Motive is very, very important in all of this.
That's right. If you try to get into any kind of truth movement or any kind of movement with the wrong mentality of what you want this for. Why do you want the truth? If you want it so you can get chicks, or if you want it so you can get famous, or so you can make a lot of money, or you're trying to
get one up.
get one up on other people, then it's not going to work out for you.
And of course, esoteric knowledge, by definition, is very alluring for a lot of people. Even for the intellectual set who get bored by jumping through the hoops and they want more power, or just generally, as you say, acquisitive people who think that they can get something material out of it. And they're not realizing, because of course there's no actual warning. It's not like you're buying a CD where the warning's right in the front of it, or a drink or alcohol. Unfortunately, when you dabble in occult areas, you're now being tested. And therefore, your motive is going to matter. It ties into what I was saying earlier about the end of the journey. It's like some sort of T.S. Eliot thing where in our endings is our beginnings. You're going to end up meeting yourself again. In a way, it is a little bit like karma. It might be a sort of subset of the karmic idea that you're going to meet that down the line. But even leaving that aside, the idea is that your motives, the reason why you get into something, is in a way going to walk with you, and it's going to skew you, and it's going to lead your path into areas that another person may not walk. That's why I emphasize to the caller how important it is to keep the individual compass in mind and never let that be stolen from you, and never also sell it yourself, because you may walk for a while with other people who are like-minded, but in the end, their road may not go where you want to go, or you may not want to go where they want to go. You see, because there's nothing uniform about any of this. It's a purely mutable thing. And this, I feel, has been lost, and partly because of the influence of religion. It's one of the biggest critiques I have about religion, is that it's so fixed, it's so immutable. They use the promissory note. They say one one Christ, one book, one set of commandments, one set of behavior, one heaven for you all.
And one hell for those who don't like it.
Oh, that's it. And remember, when they even, let's take it, what they say, when they promise you the heaven, when a Christian promises you the heaven, we often never think about this, but the heaven that they're promising us is absolutely fixed. All people will enter one zone, and all people will have to do the same rules. Can't we see the regimentation in all of this? The same Savior, the same code, the same church, the same practices, and in the end, the same heaven. I'm not making any comment about it. I'm just saying, observe the fact that does this really gel with anybody's logic circuits to imagine that a life after death is all going to be one exact same thing for everybody? I mean, does that make any sense to anyone?
No, it doesn't. It's kind of like asking a complete stranger, how do I get home? Well, that stranger's going to know how they get home, but they don't know how you get home. That your home is your home. So whenever they say, well, this is how I get home, it's not how you get home, it's how they get home.
And that same metaphor is taken up in the very first episode of the Prisoner series with Patrick McGowan. He arrives in the village, and he can't work out what on earth is going on and where he is and what is this place. So one of the first things he does is he goes into the shop and asks for a map. And the guy behind the counter pulls out this map. And number 6 opens it, and he's like looking at it, and of course it's like only the map of the village. There's no map. There's no like description of the surrounding areas. It's a completely conformist, collectivized, homogenized view of this location. So he turns around to the guy and goes, "Look, no, I meant a larger map." So the guy goes away, and basically he brings out another map that's a bit bigger in size physically, and it's color, but it's exactly the same kind of map.
That's funny.
Right? And he goes, "You don't understand what I mean by bigger." And then if you take the Prisoner series, as I do, to be a metaphor of the soul, because the actual first clip of the Prisoner, is a lightning flash. You hear a loud crack of thunder. And in esoteric symbolism, that's always a sign of the fall of the soul into matter. And there's many other symbols like the car coming from the very center of the screen and all of these different things to imply that number 6 is the soul who gets incarnated into the body, which is a symbol of the car. The car is the vehicle, and then all the rest of it. So then he falls into the village, is the soul itself coming into matter. Now, Patrick McGowan was an expert in 14th century Mannerist plays, in which the hero in those plays, they're largely Christian, and they're morality tales, and they always center around a man called Everyman. There's actually a character called Everyman, and that was the name of Patrick McGowan's production company. So he was very, very adept. He was highly skilled at analyzing these highly allegorical Christian, one of the most famous ones is John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, which everybody knows. That's one of those plays. And there's many, many others as well. So they're very allegorical, they're very symbolic in nature. And that's what The Prisoner is a modern allegory, very much to do with the Pilgrim's Progress and the fall of the soul into the world. And if you take that as being what is going on in the first episode, then you see what he's asking for. He's saying, where am I? I'm in the creation here. I'm in the world. And as a matter of fact, in the early part of the dialogue, in the very, very opening credit scenes, you hear the term saying, we want information. But the way that the word is pronounced is again done subtextually. It's actually, you hear it being said, information, which means being informed, that you are actually coming into form. So there's lots of double meanings and double entendres and subtextual stuff there. Not only talking about Big Brother and the worldly demiurge, the worldly archons that control every aspect of your destiny and all the various ways that they try to acclimatize you to the prison. Because remember, ultimately speaking, the control matrix, these controllers, the architects, are not too happy with the rebellious slave or the rebellious inmate. They want you to conform. That's what this Prisoner series was also showing you, and it's very much true for our lives. They want you to be okay with that incarceration. They want you to be part of it, and they want you to also become the prison wardens for everybody else. And many people have done that in the world. They've chosen to do that because it's easy. It's the easy way out. Because as a warden, you get slightly more soup. You get a little bit more perks than the actual prisoner, you see, who's still rebelling. So many of us have become each other's prison wardens, basically. And this is also another danger, which means that before you can even deal with the major oppressor, before you can go up the fractal and really take on something much more elusive, you're already dealing with the kind of, minor tyrants or mini tyrants around you who try to drag you back into the consensus trance. And they have 101 ways of doing that, mostly trying to pull you back into some sort of collective stance or try to prevent you from thinking freely, from debunking the little discoveries that you do make, and all of these other little mechanisms to try and get you to conform, to keep you silent, and to make sure that you stop your journey and you stop your organic flow, or that you lose faith. You lose faith in yourself and the natural flow of the world, that the world will look after you. There's something there that's always going to protect you and look after you. If people can get you out of that thinking, which is done morning, noon, and night. Sometimes people would say even the proximity of other people, this happens because we're so susceptible to this kind of influence. So it's very hard. A lot of my religion, what I would call religion or philosophy, is about constantly recentering yourself, and constantly regrounding yourself so that you're not influenced anymore. It goes with what I'm saying about the apophatic. It's not so much that you do something, it's more that you undo something. Life is more about clearing out things so that you always refine your center again. It's more like an internal process as opposed to sort of a going out and discovering new things in new ways. It's more like a return in many ways to the center of who you really are. And again, I emphasize that meditation is unique to each individual. There's no A to Z telling you how to do that. Each person must find their own way or own particular set of rituals for doing that. For some people, it could be playing music, listening to music, sitting in the garden. For some people, it's washing dishes. I ground myself by just doing housework. That's one of the best ways for me to get out of my blinking head, and just feel like a normal person, and just doing something very humble in a way.
Let me ask you this. Somebody in the chat room is asking if you can expand a little bit on the Book of Formation.
What is that?
The Book of Formation? I'm not sure.
I think he's talking about some Kabbalistic.
Yeah, I think he is.
Sefer Yetzirah or something like that. Well, all I can say pertaining to what we spoke about earlier is to realize what Blavatsky and Valentina Straighten and Norman Lockyer and many others were talking about, and also Tony Bushby's recent discoveries, is that all of the Kabbalistic school is nothing to do with the Jews. If they should be honored in any way, it's only because they preserved it. But that's about it. In many ways, they also desecrated it because they didn't know what it was. So the Kabbalah originally was Aryan. It was part of the Arya teachings. It was a known doctrine of the Arya, and they divided reality, you see, up into these 10 divisions. In fact, one of the translations of the word Kabbalah is twisted rope. And in order to understand what that means, if you think of a Celtic braid, you know how women braid their hair, or you've seen those Celtic braids, or even mosaics. You'll see a lot of stately homes, civic buildings with this sort of knotwork effect. That's what the word Kabbalah means: a twisted rope, or a descent of knowledge from up there to down here, the entwining. And of course, that has both a positive and a negative connotation. It can mean that in one way, we're untwisting reality, right? The DNA helix is theoretically said to be like that. So there's many metaphors involved in this. And often even you'll notice that in the East, the Brahmins or the Parsi people, in order to show that you've now become into that religion, that you're a Hindu, you will wear a braid. They actually put a thread on you. And I think it's the Parsis who have a braid that's 3 in 1. They actually have 3 braids that's sort of braided together as one, which ties into the Tomo, right, of the Taoists, where there's 3, the Triskelion of the Irish, the 3 spirals. This 3 in 1 is a very, very important concept. But going back to the Kabbalah, you have the 3 top sephirah, the 3 top spheres of power or knowledge or light, and then below that are 7, and those 7 are meant to be connected to the 7 chakras. And in some interpretations of the Book of Formation, they say that the top 3, this is Kether, Bina, and Yetzit, and Chokmah, those 3 are often considered really 3 aspects of one. Many Kabbalists just say, look, those 3 are one. It's like the Christian Trinity, or like I said, the Celtic 3 spirals. And the 7 stages below it are the 7 lower centers through which this knowledge, you see, descends. And so there's a whole, we could talk for hours on the Kabbalah, the meaning of the words. Of course, the Egyptians had the Ka and the Ba, and the La, the Allah, because La was actually the hieroglyphic for Ra, by the way. I know it sounds kind of weird, but the hieroglyphic for the god Ra was the eye. That famous Eye of Ra, the Eye of Horus, what later became the Eye of Horus, is the hieroglyphic for the god Ra, and it was called La. Like I said, I know it sounds a bit weird, but hieroglyphics can sometimes be also spelt backwards, and that would become La. You see, so Ka Ba La. It's just this kind of way they did things.
So the top 3, the 3 at the top of that Sephiro or whatever it is, those are connected to basically the attributes of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, and then you have the 7 at the bottom, which would be connected to the way humanity receives this knowledge.
That's right, eventually. And of course, people could say, like in the Eastern Vedic traditions, all Vedic traditions were originally Aryan as well. They were inherited from the West. They would have the 3 gunas, what are known as the 3 gunas, G-U-N-A, or those 3, or those top 3 sephirah, which are called supernal. They could represent the hypothalamus, the pineal, and the pituitary. There's many ways of looking at this. And then another school of Kabbalists go, no. We split it 5-5. Since there's 10 sephirah, spiritual energy starts at the top, comes down to Geburah, which is the 5th. And by the word, the etymology of Geburah means to break, or to divide, or to cut, or to sever. And it's at this very point that the spiritual energy becomes material. In other words, it's at the 5th sephirah, which is the most destabilized chakra, or most destabilized area, in which now spiritual energy has to meet the resistance of the material. And this is why, from there on, all spiritual energy will be contaminated with a certain amount of material energy, more and more as it descends. And that's why in certain Kabbalistic schools, Geburah is considered the house of Mars and the house of Lucifer, or the satanic devilish principle, because it's the most destabilized, and therefore would have the greatest challenges attached to it, etc., etc., etc. And there's refutations of that school as well, where people go, now wait a minute, we don't even believe that that's insinuating that material world is anti-spiritual. That already creates a philosophical problem, but we don't want to get into all of that. Then there's other people who say it's 9 and 1, that Malkuth at the bottom is 1, and then the 9 above it. So this is the beauty of Kabbalah. It's like a Rubik's Cube. It's a beautiful thing in which you can get into and study. It's something that was a very ancient doctrine. I love it because it's basically a tree. This is what gives it away, that it's originally Druidic. Even though they have done their best to make it look like some sort of Lego set with these circles and lines, look, it's a tree, all right? Face it. And that was the oak, that was the yew tree. This was a doctrine that was central. We find it in Nordic countries in which Odin's tree, Yggdrasil, the fantastic world ash tree, and you'll find it in all the traditions of the world, the Kabbalistic tree that often looked like a spiral or what have you, the twisted rope.
Let me ask you this,
and
Michael.
It's basically a metaphor of the soul, a metaphor of the mind.
Let me ask you this. There's a lot of talk of transhumanism, eugenics, and whatnot, and that can sound similar to transcending into the spiritual, but it seems like the Illuminati or elite or whoever's behind this New World Order, they want to do this physically. What is Blavatsky's take on all of this, on transhumanism, eugenics? Is that part of the New Age, and does that tie into Atlantis at all?
Yes, it does, because remember, she always spoke about how man fell from the primal light of all-knowing, and it was through the misuse of occult knowledge and technology. Again, these are the points that our critics never bring up, because they could give a damn about occultism. They just want to bash her. They're not really interested in the metaphysics she was talking about. In her work, she talks about the root races and all of these things, and one aspect I do like about her is because she does talk about the Atlantean age. I use the word Atlantean in a slightly different context, but generally speaking, it means the prehistorical, or what's known as the pre-Diluvian period. And she's on that level, we're in sync. Her Atlantean world is my pre-Diluvian world, that I speak about in the Atlantis book.
Yeah.
In those realms, prehistorical realms, there was the very high knowledge. This is where the great adepts learned their knowledge. And we know that this knowledge must have existed because there's just too much sophisticated knowledge about language, about the stars, about astrology, about the movement of the sun, the zodiac. Let's even take herbalism. How on earth could they know to make the concoctions that they know how to make all over the world? Concoctions which is completely statistically impossible. Out of thousands and thousands of plants to make certain combinations, both hallucinogenic and other, is literally statistically impossible for so-called primitive people to ever work out. So, there's umpteen. I've got tons of the stuff in my Atlantis book and on the Atlantis website showing that it's obvious to a person who's using their brain that in ancient times there was this great knowledge. Okay, well, it's not here anymore. What happened? Blavatsky would have been from the school who very much believed that it was abused in some way. And I also believe that too, that either technologically or something to do with the intellect of man, something to do with the trauma that took place all around him, there was a falling off, a spiritual falling off. Lots of other occultists talk about this, and really, ultimately, scientists are coming to this conclusion, and so are psychologists, that there's something up, that at the base of consciousness there is this trauma, you see. Mm-hmm. And then the sacred knowledge of the adepts, including Kabbalah and all these other divination arts, have been appropriated by the bent ones, the fallen ones, the people who have, basically soulless ones who are trying to control the world. And they use the fact that man has been traumatized. They co-opt that fact so that they know that man is already vulnerable, he's weak, and he can be easily manipulated, you see. So Blavatsky was the kind of person who I believe was trying to purify people. She was a healer. She was somebody who tried to use esoteric knowledge to clean people so that they become more immune, so that they become spiritually stronger. She wasn't one of these people who used occultism to dumb people down, to manipulate them, to subliminally control them, you see, and all of this. She wasn't into any of that. And what was your question again? It was specifically about technology, right?
About transhumanism and eugenics.
Oh, yeah. No, see, that's well put, because she, like myself, would have warned people desperately about this, that you cannot artificially upgrade the human being to the what's known in occult terms as the quintessence, or the fifth element, which is what technological people are desperately trying to do. is part of the reason why they abuse the pentagram, by the way, because there's an elaborate theory in which the pentagram, the 5 points, represent that fifth element, what's called epsilon, or the quintessence. It's theoretically the level to which man is meant to go, right? The super intelligent level. That's why the Chrysler Building, the Penthouse magazine, Prodigy, Pentium computers, the Pentagon. This is why you see so many of these orgs that are basically fronts for the military complex and technology use the pentagram as a symbol. You'll find it all over the place. Mm-hmm. It's because that is a symbol of occultism, because all the technological and scientific orgs that we know about, I don't care what it is, the Genome Project, MIT, CIT, I don't care where you find it, Sun Corporation, Microsoft, Apple, all of these organizations are occult. They're part of a great sorcery. They're part of an enormous ritual that's taking place. Just because every punk who works there doesn't understand this doesn't change the fact. And the development of the agricultural age, moving up to the industrial age, the silicon age, all of this has been a motion down through time, and Blavatsky was very aware of it, because she in her writing said that 5 other ages of man had fallen because of the same problem or a similar level. That ages come, they rise to their peak, and then sorcery takes place. And why does the sorcery take place? Because good people fail to act. Good people lose their psychological immunity. The protections get down, right? The immigration officers fall asleep. And it's exactly what's been happening in our age. Wherever you find an evil, it's because the good have fallen asleep and left the gates wide open to that pestilence, where once they actually had the power. But get back more to the point of technology. There's a theories abounding that, and even you find this in certain science fiction like Star Trek, but there's actually an understanding that there is emergence between the technologies of the world, right, including silicon and computers and organic computers, and the mind of man. There's ideologists who believe this. Many of them are in the technical field. They're hell-bent on this. And there's also a positive reading of this as well, that there has to be some sort of fusion between carbon and silicon life forms, and that this will open the inner eye, and then man will be who he needs to be. This is sort of underlying the post-human idea, that there is a higher level of consciousness that is required. It involves the fusion of man and machine, the upgrading of man, and again, from an occult point of view, it means the transcendence of man to this fifth element. Now, the teachers like Blavatsky are going, wait a minute, nothing that you can do of your own effort or will can upgrade you to that level. That's not that you can't do things, but that won't necessarily lead to that state, because if you're unworthy, then obviously it's a no-brainer that you're going to end up in insanity, not in enlightenment, right? So you have the right to do things. You have the right to clean yourself. You have the right to purify yourself. But don't think that that in itself is going to actualize the fifth element. Now, these technotronic people, these post-humanists, cannot accept that. They really do 100% believe that individually, personally, on themselves, and in society in general, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And that by twiddling about with the DNA, that's number one, and twiddling about with the technologies of the world, you are going to be able to artificially inherit this fifth element. So when you see the magician standing in the pentagram, that's a metaphor for this. Because don't forget that leaves, right, the Fibonacci series, looking at the way trees grow, the number 5 is always connected with growth. It's very much connected with growth. You'll find this pentagonal shape in apples and in so many other areas of life. So that actually represents growth and expansion and transcendence. If you look at the crucifixion of Jesus and why he was on a square cross, connecting to the fifth element again, and the 4 letters above his head, representing 4 lower states, he's ready to transcend to the higher state, or the pharaoh sitting on the 4 square cube, being himself the meta-human or the fifth element, you see. But the problem is that there's a division within the occult schools between those people, and they're all occultists. But the sorcerers believe that you have to co-opt technology. This is what is the birth of all of this nonsense. That in some way technology, right, in some sort of unison with biology, genetics. That's what this whole genome project is really all about. And by the way, that's why they continually use the symbol of the serpent. Right, on the medical corporations and on all of these genome projects, the serpent is appearing over and over again, because these sorcerers are part of a dragon court. They're part of the Brotherhood of the Snake. They've been working on this for thousands of years, certainly hundreds and hundreds of years they've been working on this. And then you have the other school of other occultists who go, no, no, no. The power that oversees man's transcendence is purely natural, and therefore it is a complete yogic unison with the forces of nature as they are, letting nature be your guide in a much different way. It's almost like you could say Nuth and Hadith. Aleister Crowley used the terms Nuth and Hadith to represent these opposing factions. Blake used the term prolific and devouring. In the tarot cards you have the 7th and 8th card representing these two dichotomies. One is tantric, the other is ascetic. One is the path of ecstasy, right? The crooked road, and the other is the straight, formal, rigid road. We have it in our brains when we talk about left and right hemisphere. You have yin and you have yang. There's many, many modalities. The nagual and the tonal. You have so many ways of giving language to this particular dichotomy. Two approaches to the same gnosis. And we're in a race. This is what history has basically been. I'm not a Hegelian, but I can certainly say that you can look into history, and in one way you can absolutely see this. It's like art and physics, perhaps is another way of expressing it. But again, it depends what school you're coming from. And it's the crooked road versus the straight road. It's the path of the magician as opposed to the path of the mystic. The path of the arrow as opposed to the path of the serpent. There's so many different ways to language this. And you'll find this in all the metaphors of life. All the myths and legends speak about this. If you use this as a metaphor, you'll see it. It's all through astrology, it's all through tarot, it's all through mythology. You can find it in the story of King Arthur and Robin Hood, Merlin. I mean, whatever myth you go to, you'll find this metaphor. And each individual in the world today is polarized by that decision that they make. And that doesn't mean that it can't change. If you listen to the song Stairway to Heaven, he says there are two roads you can go on, but you can change the road if you so desire. So there's people who will take one road, who will flip over and go, look, I'm done with this, I want to try the other road. But basically they represent this model of the ascetic life, which is rigid and fixed and masculine and acquisitive and phallocentric and ultimately patriarchal and even hierarchical. And then on the other side, you have the holarchic model, which is feminine and yin and tantric. And I've always seen that this is very accurate in life. And people fall into these categories. And the technological side can be used by both. See, even the tantric side, the yin side, is fine with technology. It's just that, again, it's how you're using the wand, right? It's how you're using the knife and fork. You may have a gun. It depends what you're using it for. You can either use it to defend yourself or you can use it to go around killing people. So don't blame the technology. It's just that something has happened in the school of these sorcerers where they really are looking to find that bridge between the world, between the silicon, the technical, and the biological. And the computer is part of the step on that way of arriving at that place. And there's many other things that they're up to. But unfortunately, in my research, I'm not into that because I found out that a lot of really dark things are involved in this. Many, many, many dark things are involved in this particular progress. And ultimately it's doomed to failure. And the Blavatskys warned about this, that other great civilizations had crumbled because of this. And that you can't tamper with nature's laws. You have to be obedient to nature's ordinances. You can't be like a mad child running around doing what you want, because that has severe consequences. That was picked up in the metaphor Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The idea of that. And by the way, I just remembered the name of the first woman who created the Gothic genre. Her name was Anne Radcliffe. She was one woman who didn't have to write under a pseudonym, but anyway, that's besides the point. The point going back is that the Frankenstein mythology is about this technological idea that you can live forever, have all sorts of powers, cure disease. Well, you don't even realize why disease exists, but you want to cure it? I mean, hey, what happens if there's actually a reason for disease? You see, so there's all these metaphysical and philosophical points that these guys never think about, but they're always wanting to put earrings on the Mona Lisa and fix what isn't broken,
Let me ask you this. Is the God particle the same as the fifth element?
It's a metaphor for it, I would say. I'm not totally up to speed on it, but I do know that ideologically, all these things that these people are doing, they think of themselves as the new Templars, as the new saints, as the people who are going to open all sorts of magical doors for us through science. They're possessed by this idea. Yeah, they're sort of like possessed by it. But what they don't realize is that there's some very, very brilliant things that will come of that. It's not altogether a bad idea. But at the same time, if you take it too far, there's dangers as well. Because the hierarchical model is ultimately, if taken to extremes, completely psychopathic. As the other side, the tantric side, if taken to extremes, becomes pure debauchery. Becomes irrational. It has its own downfalls, you see. So in some way there has to be some sort of blending or balance. And again, that's what we were talking about earlier, about very ambivalent things, needing to be balanced. I mean, there's nothing we can do about it. There is only male and there's only female. For some strange reason, we've come into this world and there are these dichotomies, there are these antipodes, or antinomonies, or whatever you want to call it. And there they are. We have some sort of balancing act to do. And technology, I think, is all about who's using it and what for. But when it's combined with this power drive, this sick power drive to gain power over the world, and ultimately I do believe that the people behind us are sociopaths, they're completely sick psychopaths who have no inner order. And therefore, the person who has no inner structure or inner order will have this particular drive to have external order imposed upon them, in the same way that you have stabilizers on a paraplegic, so that you can walk. They need this outer shell, this armoring, because they have actually no inner psychological order. And that's why you keep hearing them talking about order, is because they're the most disorganized people. And I can prove it because I've gone to their sources and I found their own quotes about life and reality and all sorts of things, and they're crazy. This was brought out very strongly in the Dr. Strangelove movie, in that bizarre scene which Robert Ryan played to perfection, where he's ranting on about women and semen and enemies and all of this stuff. It's beautifully portrayed in the hard-bodied, masculine, acquisitive, ultimately violent, and ultimately self-sadistic, self-destructive, you see, personality type. There's various different terms for this. Erich Fromm used the term necrophilic in the true meaning of that word, lovers of death. But he went on to say that just when I say necrophilia and I say love of death, I don't mean sewers. I don't mean feces and toilets. I mean the sterile buildings, the laboratories, the super clean cities, the super clean Track 29 gardens. There can be a deathly sterility, which is what our societies are also become. That kind of morbid, necrophiliac mindset is found in our shopping malls, for goodness sake. In the squareness and the roboticness and the regimentation. That is more deadly than anything else.
Because it is regimented, because it's a collectivism that you were talking about. How everything has to be the same, everything has to be perfect. They're control freaks. These people are that you talk about that are psychopathic and sociopathic. They're control freaks, and so they have such turmoil going on in their own minds that they project a control freak attitude about everything else that's
right.
External.
That's brilliant, and it's brilliantly put out in certain films that show you this incredibly. And I lost the trail of what. It ties into what we were saying earlier on about that. Remember, we said find out what is false.
Yeah.
And become familiar with that. That's a help in many ways. When people learn what are the hallmarks of the anti-truth, the pseudo-truth, one of them is this collectivism. So you've got a rule of thumb. Look around, and whatever you see bears this extreme collectivism. That's already your pointer. You've already learned something now. Be aware of it. I'm not talking about some loose collectivism, which is necessary. You go to the park with your kids, everybody else does that, or you drive your car. I'm not a fanatic. But in general, you have to see where this ideology is at play. And you certainly do find it in the media, you find it in society, you find it in fashion, you find it in sports. You see, where there's a penchant to be rigid. And a person can decide for themselves how much of it they want to continue doing and how much they want to lose. Again, it's like Aristotle's mean. The mean is not the same for everybody. Everybody will find their own way, to adjust to where they want to go. It's like guitar players, everybody there's one guitar, but there's so many different kinds of players. I mean, I'm a guitar player, so even if you turn the TV volume down, I can tell who's playing the guitar just by looking at their hands. If it's Dave Mustaine, say it's Segovia, or it's a Jimmy Page, there's a style. Everybody has their own style. Stevie Ray Vaughan. So one guitar, one music, but boom, what have you got? There's something amazing about the human being. He's not a computer. He's not a technological creature in that sense. Technology is subservient to his own organic flow. What these characters want to do is change that dynamic round. They want to make the technological, the scientific, dominant. And that's another big brother mechanism of having everybody fall into regimentation. And the problem is we are ready to buy into it because all the other rooting, all the other cultural roots, all the other psychological pylons have been blasted, have been uprooted. And so as every day goes by, as every month goes by, as every year goes by, we are in fact becoming more and more leaning. We're leaning more and more. We're becoming weaker and weaker. We just don't notice it because it happens slowly, over time, gradually. And therefore, I feel that we're almost going back to the Middle Ages, where lives were full of superstition. People were basically hallucinating most of the time. As I say, we have the veneer of affluence, so we kind of don't see this. We don't realize that affluence can be more deadly a way of controlling people than want. You can pacify rebellion by the carrot more than you can do with the stick. They've done the stick. They've done the stick treatment for thousands of years. It's no longer working. People are leaving the churches. They're getting fed up with a lot of this unsustainable rubbish. So the stick isn't really working too well.
People are
and therefore they're now using the carrot method. Very much in the Western Hemisphere, of course, that's the case.
People are waking up for sure. Let's go to a quick break and to the website, and we are speaking with Michael Tsarion. Of course, his website is michaeltsarion.com, and don't forget to check out his new DVD, Architects of Control, which I have to say is probably one of my favorite documentaries that I've seen recently. Michael, there's several people in the chat room asking, what are some of your favorite metal bands?
I'd say that I've got so many favorites. I like Creator, of course, and I like Candlemass, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin. There's so many I could list.
Are there any that are aligned with the truth message?
Oh, many. Creator, a band from Germany, are very much up to speed. I think way so. I mean, the guy was playing guitar and speaking truth from 12 years old or something like that. And 14 years of age when he put his band together, so these guys are way ahead. Leif Edling from Candlemass, a guy I've met and talked to, I have an incredible respect for. He's also one of the most bizarre people I've ever met from an energy point of view. A very, very interesting human being. His band and many of the albums that they have done, have deeply inspired me. But you even have bands like Accept, from the old school, and Judas Priest. I mean, I find that metal is a really interesting kind of music. I've played it myself, always been interested in it, and I think Bruce Dickinson, Iron Maiden are absolutely like the kings of metal, if you want to use that term, because of their constant development. And I've often described the Iron Maiden lexicon as a book of philosophy. If you were actually to get all their CDs, you're pretty much good to go there, because there's a lot of heavy stuff there that's very, very eclectic and brilliant and symphonic and also educational, really way so, and in a very applicable way, you see, because again, not all learning should be a burden, and it's also good to be from a right brain point of view. And I like music because it is the left brain working with the technology of music and amplifiers and things like that, and the skill of singing and all of the different technology that goes into that. But at the same time, these musicians, and I particularly highlight the heavy metal musicians, because they're drawing upon the reservoir of the right brain, and also they have that dose of rebellion, which I like a lot, because they're not conformists. There's a certain level of conformity there, maybe say in the fashion statement or whatever, but it's basically topical. Underneath that, the message is very much a rebellion of a message of be yourself and do your own thing your own way. I'm a real big fan of Typo Negative, who I think are exceptional musicians, and I love that gothic metal style. You know, Testament. I really like the band Testament. I think the album The Ritual is probably one of the greatest albums ever made. I know they don't like it too much, but I consider that a very, very brilliant. I love the lyrics in that a lot. I like all of Testament's work. Rob Halford's individual work, Megadeth. I think I love all of Megadeth's stuff. Even the fans sort of dropped off, disliking some of the stuff that they did in the later part of the 90s. Mm-hmm. I think what's wrong with you guys? Why don't you listen to the lyrics? You know, they're fantastic. I must also say that their production is brilliant, as is their their technical ability.
Symphony of Destruction, that was one of their best ones, I think.
Yeah, and now we even have Dave Mustaine himself dipping into the conspiracy. They did a latest album on that. He appeared on Alex Jones. So he's a broad-minded guy who's, looking deeply into matters. Earlier on, he was into politics and trying to get people to vote. But I think he realized, that's a dead end. And he evolved very much like Alex Jones himself has done beautifully through the years. These people evolve, and I love to see that. But Metallica, of course, they've done some fantastic work. Manowar, I really like Manowar, Slayer, I was big fans of Slayer, huge fans of them. Halloween, you asked me earlier about bands that really have a statement that's more like pertaining to the conspiracy. Then I would definitely say Kai Hansen's Gamma Ray, and earlier he was in the band Halloween, and if you listen to their albums, they got some very powerful things to say. They did a song called Phantoms of Death, Giants. My God, there's some incredible stuff there by Gamma Ray. No World Order is one of their albums, which totally people should listen to,
Excellent.
I mean, the list goes on. There's so many great bands, both in the very heavier metal bands, that have come out. Some of those are very good. And then there's lots and lots and lots of metal I really don't like, that I think is totally false and just hideous.
I think that goes for every genre of music, definitely. Cherie, there was a email question that I wanted to get on the record. Can you pick that one up?
Okay. Yeah, he's asking, I'm from India, and it's about the ethnic war in Sri Lanka. I'm from India, and I've read some reports that says an ethnic cleansing of sorts, like what's happening in Iraq of suspected Anunnakis, is taking place. Let me know if you have the time. Maybe I can send you more details. This person, I don't think they know English very well, but do you know anything about that?
Well, yeah, these places were very rich in minerals, and therefore the British East India Company, who actually they're also behind the Thuggee. They're also behind a lot of criminal institutions like the Tong in China, and also the Triads. All of these groups, including the Thuggee and many other criminal organizations, and who are now, you'd find these political groups. These were all funded and created by the British royals, because they wanted to leave England. They wanted to leave India in a state of total chaos when they pulled out. Therefore, they had to create a division between the Hindus and the Muslims, which, of course, there was the fighting over Pakistan, Bengal, and India. Right, there's millions of deaths. That was deliberately caused. Mahatma Gandhi tried to do his best to stop it, but he couldn't. And down in Sri Lanka, which used to be called Ceylon, by the way, its original name was Ceylon, they did the same thing again, to suppress all of the indigenous people down there, who had already been suppressed for hundreds of years. The suppression of Ceylon goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, where the original Dravidian peoples, the original indigenous peoples, had always been subjugated in various ways. And so they want the minerals. It's also, by the way, a strategic place. There's certain observations of the heavens that can only be made from Ceylon. There's certain military reasons why they want to there. It was also a place where, in the time of the Elizabethan age, the pirates used to bury their gold, you see, and bring their slaves, and also including Fiji and the Seychelles Islands. These are very important to the maritime law and to maritime to shipping and all of the things that the British government tried to control, you see. So Ceylon has been the center of so much trouble, just as being Thailand and Malaysia and all of these Eastern Bloc countries. Not Eastern Bloc, but you know what I'm saying, the Far Eastern countries. And the history of these places is very interesting. I really don't know that much about it. I'm more up to speed on what happened in northern India, you know, between the Hindus and the Muslims and so on. But all of these divisions, all of these religious divisions, and all of these ethnic divisions, these are all manufactured by Britain. It goes for Europe, it goes for the Middle East. How they purposely, deliberately put ethnic peoples beside each other who have long hated each other, have nothing in common culturally with others. The British, after the Second World War, and after the First World War, I mean, through the Balfour Declaration and various other policies, purposely made sure that very, very dissimilar peoples would be forced to live in colonies side by side, because they knew that that would lead to a Second World War. They knew that that would lead to various other conflicts in the world. Never leave the world in a state of conflict. It goes back to what we were saying psychologically earlier on about the people who are in a state of complete spiritual, moral, and intellectual depravity. Want to make the world into the state of chaos, and they've been able to do this through the banks, the world banks. What do you think all this immigration is today? Where the whole Western world is flooded with immigrants. Just because the World Bank has so impoverished all of these foreign countries. Instead of helping them to live in their own countries and giving them aid, they've completely or officially impoverished Mexico and impoverished the East and impoverished Africa. And then they say, we'll open the doors of the affluent West, where people have worked to the bone to create that affluence, and now you're going to share it with all these people who don't bloody deserve it. And no matter how many people warned about this, that you can't create two impoverishments, neither culture is going to be benefited from this hideous action. You don't do it in your own home, or if you did, you would soon learn the lesson, and you certainly can't do it in society. It has nothing to do with racism or anything else what I'm talking about. It's a simple immigration quota fact that for hundreds of years was obeyed and things were good. What on earth has got into people's minds? But this is this colonialization, and it has many, many permutations. And the East has been a threat, so they had to dumb down the Eastern people are backward intellectually. That's why they've been kept that way. In the Eastern Bloc, in the communist countries, right, what happened there? Well, massacre, genocide, and then artificially suppressing them with a fake ideology. And also making sure that they were materially in a great state of want. Because the powers that be are a small group. They can't, in fact, control the whole world normally. You can only work on one part of it. So while you're busy working on the target that you really want, these generals, these experts, they made sure that they split the world into the trilateral idea. And that in the Eastern Bloc, this is why the Russians, the Soviet troops, were allowed into Berlin, even though the American troops were technically there before. And they were told to hold back. Eisenhower told Patton to not go into Berlin and to wait for the Red Army to go in. And Patton screamed blue murder, so he was murdered. He was actually killed. This is known fact. Because he was going to create hell when he got back to America, talking about this incident. Why were the Soviet troops let to go in? It's because it was to divide Berlin, to divide Germany, which is exactly what happened all over Europe, not only in Germany. The communists were allowed to go in because the same people who fund communism, right, are the same people doing the experiments in the West, but they had to artificially put it on ice. They had other reasons for it as well, of course, but you divide and you conquer. You keep Europe under ice, you keep it on the back burner, right? And in the third world, you simply massacre and impoverish them materially and keep them in an intellectually completely dumbed down state. And you do that through religion. You do that through the brand of religion. We said earlier, I have no time for these Eastern religions on the most part, except Taoism and a little bit of Jainism. I've got some, much more lenient with those. But on the whole, I understand what religion has done in India and these other places. And you do this within countries, and you do it broadly across the globe. And then when you turn, when you're finished with the main project, you have time now to turn to those other potatoes and say, well, now we're going to handle you. Which is why NATO went in to handle the Serbs. And the immense atrocities have been done to the Serbian people. You see, that now they could be handled. Now Iraq and Kuwait and all of these places could be handled. Because you put in dictators, you put in tyrants, you put in people who will either freeze everything and keep things in a state of total arrested development materially and socially and religiously. And then you create the antithesis to that. We see it going on today with the Islamic conflict with the Christian world. That's for a reason. And how these primitive people who treat women so badly and believe in all this nonsense in religion, you see, they're now being purposely given hegemony. The doors are purposely being opened so that this conflict can be created.
Well, that's a lot to digest.
And then was it Rush Limbaugh? Yeah, it was Rush Limbaugh the other day comes out and says all the people who lost families lost their family on 9/11 should be outraged that Obama's not going after Muslim radicals or Muslim extremists, and he's not mentioning them as Muslim radicals or Muslim extremists. So, you've got all these people that are paid to stir up the pot of division, just to try to start wars, just to try to keep everybody separated.
Oh yeah, the Glenn Becks, the Jon Stewarts, the Bill Mayers, this slug you just mentioned. They are there as the mouthpieces of dissent. They pretend to take an opposite view. They have maybe a sheen of humor, or like Bill O'Reilly, a sheen of antagonism. You see, and this is all done to stir up all of these partisan divisions, which if left for a few minutes, people wouldn't even be really buying into. They're so illogical that you drop them. So they have to keep up churning the pot, as you say, to keep this thing going. Yeah, okay, if they're going to go after some sort of Islamic extremists, why don't they also go after the Carlyle Group and various other organizations who created these Talibans and these other maniacs over there?
Right.
These freaks, these lunatics and extremists have been incubated by the same colonial forces who've been doing this from day one. And then any voice of true logic who's ever stood up to warn the human race about what's been going on, they've either been silenced, or they've been assassinated professionally, or even physically assassinated. The Enoch Powells come to mind, the David Dukes come to mind. There's so many people who've stood up to warn people, and they've been labeled extremists, they've been labeled, and extremists are running the shop. I said recently on another interview, can you think of anything more hideous than the American people forgetting who their enemy is? 200 years is really ultimately not a lot of time in history. How could it be that the Americans have forgotten that the British government, the British establishment is their enemy? And therefore, having forgot that, they not only leave the door wide open for those very agents of the British Crown to come in and take over the government of America. Half of these people are even knighted by the Queen. Not only are they now ensconced through the federal orgs in America, but that they wake up in the morning, devise a faux opponent in some foreign land, and say, hey, you guys, wake up, march off to war, march off to more ritual slaughter, get suited up, and go over and fight these enemies that you don't even have the faintest idea what they're doing and why you oppose them. And this even goes for the war against Germany, which don't even get me started on that. But even in recent history. So in other words, American boys and girls are going to die and spill blood for a supposed faux enemy on foreign shores, while the real enemy is the one telling them where to go and rolling on their backs in the federal orgs, the Greenspans, the Roosevelts, the Woodrow Wilsons, the Trumans, the Eisenhowers, the Clintons, the Holbrooks, the Wolfowitzes, the Caseys, the Eagleburgers, the Weinbergers. All of these people can just point a finger, through their media oracles, stir everybody up to wave their little flag, and Americans go and die on foreign shores and foreign wars of which they have nothing to do with it, impoverishing the country, creating incredible enemies, weakening all the structures and bringing a bad name to the country, and the real enemies, which can be proven, it's not even a matter of negotiation, are in the country as the leaders. We're voting them in. What more can a person imagine is a travesty in this world? And very much the same thing goes for England and all the other places that are under colonial power. This is what people have got to wake up to.
Yeah, because it kind of lowers the people of that nation down to a dumb animal, a dog that you say, okay, go get him, boy, and they don't know why they're attacking that person, but their master said to attack them, so they're going to attack them.
Well, they did the same thing to us, though, in September of 2001. The whole country was rallying to get these terrorists.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing as
and dumb.
That.
And dumb is the right word for it, because as people might have learned some of this history, because remember, the one downside of the criminal is if he keeps repeating the modus operandi, then the detective becomes aware of what's called the pattern, right? The motive. It's the what do they call it? It's the profile. All criminals repeat a certain profile. Over time, I think the other side is also aware that we might crack it. We might get a bit aware of this particular profile. So then the other thing that they must continually do is dumb down the youth, so that the youth is completely going to buy into this propaganda whenever it should happen that they need this kind of conflict thing to take place. If you have an educated class coming out of universities and schools that know a bit about history and might in fact know that, wait a minute, we kind of did this 10 years ago, or we did this 50 years ago, or wait a minute, this is repeat. Well, that's not going to work, and eventually people will give up because they'll know what's going on. But the answer to that is to dumb down people with a lot of false history on television, through PBS and through all of the other oracles, or this over-romanticized, kind of Clive Burns rubbish, or whatever his name is, this PBS type of full romantic historization.
Right.
Or it's just completely dumbed down people so they don't even have a faintest idea.
So that people
what is going on.
So that people don't realize in 2001, hey, didn't we fund Osama bin Laden?
Yeah.
Didn't we help him way back in the 80s? That people don't remember that.
Right. And why are these Kissingers still around? Why are the same advisors still around? Why does the president come and tell us, I'm going to change things in the administration, and it's the same old cronies, the sort of second fiddle guys who control it? Why are the same think tanks involved? Why are the same orgs? Why, in other words, why does nothing change?
It's a democratic dictatorship.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, though.
Incredible.
How does the third eye and the pineal gland play into all of this? Because it seems like there's a constant attack with fluoride and everything like that. Is that one of the ways they keep people dumbed down, and is the key in the pineal gland?
Yeah, not only with fluoride and those kinds of poisons, like aspartame and these things, but also by the use of light. When I taught the children at the New Age Academy School and other places, we looked at how the media and even the world in general, why skyscrapers use the fluorescence, why fluorescent light is used in schools, why basically our cities are super lit all the time, so much so that it even blocks out the natural light of the stars. We don't even really experience natural light anymore, to tell you the truth. There's so much artificial light around. And that affects the pineal gland because the pineal
is stimulated. It's stimulated by light.
Yes, it is. And it is also connected to serotonin and melatonin. And melatonin, in Latin, the word has to do with darkness. It's also, by the way, the hormone that has now been associated with independence.
Really?
And, yeah, this was known by the powers that be, which is why they, under interrogation, the habit has been always to shine a bright light in your face. It's also the reason why the police, when they pull you over, not only shine the torch in your face, but they usually have the big headlight. I mean, obviously it's for protection. They don't want to get shot or something. But it's also psychological reasons as well, because when you shine bright light at somebody, it reduces the flow of melatonin, and that is the hormone of rebellion, or the hormone of standing up for yourself. So we actually live in a laboratory. Our cities now have become...
Is that why Walmart has so many fluorescent lights that give you headaches?
All the malls are like this. All the malls, I've had a big problem with this for years. All the malls being so way super lit. I mean, way more than you'd need it to be. And most places are like this. I mean, I've walked into places, it's like I nearly go mad. It's like, what the hell is this? And then you talk to these zombified people who have the unfortunate, unfortunately have to work in these places day after day after day. I mean, I've done it myself, so I mean, know firsthand, it's despicable. And this is part of a whole ideology of light. And in fact, when we even take it up a few levels and we talk even about why the Illuminati are calling themselves that, the princes of light, the keepers of light, they use the symbol of light, is because light has certain properties we continually forget about. Light is destructive as well as creative. Light can conceal as much as it reveals. You flash a bright halogen light in somebody's face and they're blinded. If you're shielded by light, nobody can see you, right? So light has certain occult properties that people need to start thinking about. And these occultists at the top level that we've been talking about, the Gaiornum, the princes of light, they know how to manipulate light in many ways. And so to introduce this to the people I've taught, it's like I say, okay, just let's watch some commercials here. Let's watch a few minutes of TV and just notice one thing. The usage of light, how light is being fired at you constantly and repetitiously and so forth and so on. If you're not aware of it, it has terrible effect. If you're aware of it, it's not so bad. But the thing is that we need to be aware of this because that's another form of the psychic dictatorship. In the occult tradition, light is considered to be phallic. It's almost like a sword. It's almost like a lance. It's a weapon that can be used and has been used by the people who consider themselves the keepers of light. So again, we have this whole religious connotation of light being connected to enlightenment and purity and all these kinds of things. And to an extent, that's true. But I've always tried to redefine light. I've worked a lot on that. We've spoken about it many times. That, hey, what about even the other connotation of the word light in terms of weight?
Is that why
I try to get people into that mode of thinking, hey, let's just toy with that idea for a minute. That enlightenment might in fact have something to do with lightness. As like in the tarot card 22, the zero, the fool. You see this kind of lightness. And it's strange that in some of the most spiritual people I've ever met, that is in fact the quality that they have, is this kind of what only can be described as lightness, or maybe another word would be detachment, or whatever you want to call it. So I ask people to question that. Just bear in mind that there's another connotation there.
Is that why they call Lucifer the light bearer?
Oh, that's just connected to the planet Venus.
Oh, okay.
There's nothing satanic about it at all. It's purely an astrological, astrotheological. Luz being light, Fera meaning the holder of the light, the keeper of the light. It was actually the full name was Diana Lucifera. Do you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
There's a big controversy right now in I guess around the world about Lucifer versus Satan. Who is Lucifer? Who is Satan? Are they the same person? I really have no idea. Can you explain that for me?
I've done a lot of work on that. We've done it in other interviews as well, but there is no connection, basically, briefly. Remember we were talking about the disinformation around Blavatsky and how people will just snowball, things, just certain wrong idea snowballs, and
right.
Something enters into the collective mind and that's it. You can't even unroot it. This is another one. Lucifer is a completely separate concept. And so when you see the Albert Pikes and the Mazzinis and these other people talking about Lucifer, but you happen to be coming from a Christian point of view, and you've been reading mistranslations of the Bible, mistranslations of this, garbage spoken to you from the pulpit, and you then associate Lucifer with Satan, well, this is what's going to happen. Yeah, there is something rotten in what the Masons are talking about, but you're never going to crack it by coming from that partisan point of view. The Lucifer that they're speaking of is just a code word for Aton, because Lucifer is the son of the morning. That meant the sun at the rising horizon of the morning, and the other true word for that is Adonai or Aton. They're Atonists. Lucifer is a code word because it originally represented, one of the interpretations anyway, again it depends what country you're coming from and also what cult you're coming from. But to certain cults, Lucifer was Venus. Then I said, as I told you earlier, Diana, Lucifer. Well, Diana's the goddess of the moon, which is very bright. It's the second sun. She's considered the sun of the night, you see. So that is therefore also a connotation. Then it was feminized in general. There's a French word, luce, an old ancient French word that meant the fish. So this ties it not only into the womb, the vagina and the female, but it also ties it into Jesus, the Christians and their symbol of the fish, representing underground knowledge or Pisces, a lot of astrological stuff there. And then Satan was a Hebrew word that meant nothing more than opposer. And it didn't even have a religious connotation, by the way. It had a I guess you'd call it political connotation in the synagogues and also in the Gnostic cults, like the Essenes or these groups, the Zadokites. When they had a debate and you sat around in a circle and everybody was debating, whoever was the person who took the opposite point of view was considered the Satan. That was the word that was used for him. Satan. Shaitan. All it meant was the one who contradicts. And in fact, in the earliest translations of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, the word Satan doesn't even appear. It didn't have that connotation at all. And more importantly, the word Lucifer absolutely did not appear. That is completely concocted. And has no relevance whatsoever.
It appeared in Isaiah.
Word.
It appeared in Isaiah, though, didn't it?
Well, I know that it did in that book, and it was translated as such, and that's where we go to it. When people point to it, and that's where the first term comes up. But when you read that particular Isaiah comment, you will be able to decode it quite easily when you understand that it's talking about celestial bodies.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Absolutely. The fallen one, even the idea that it was connected to something fallen, right, is to do with planetary cosmic events. That's all it has to do with it. It's okay though if later on one of its this is the way words are. I'm not against it. I'm saying okay, if a word then takes on a secondary or third meaning and okay it gets connected to the evil one, by all means that's fine. Just don't forget what its original meaning is. This is what's happened. Years have gone by and people have forgot what it really means, and then it's used so broadly, or it's used what's called
Loosely.
denotatively to denote Satan or evil, that people forget then that it has many, many other meanings as well and many other connotations, and some of them are not necessarily negative. The idea is what people have to, and this ties right back to what we were saying about the Christians and groups like that, like Judeos, Christians, have to worry about maybe their orders are created by the same hidden hand that they're pointing at. Well, what happens when you really realize that when Albert Pike and these people are using the term Lucifer, they actually mean Jehovah. Because Aton is Adonai, is Jehovah. So there you have a problem. A Christian who comes to the work of Albert Pike going, hey, he's evil, he's Scottish Rite, he's a Mason, he's a Illuminati, look at him talking about Lucifer. Yes, but the problem is, his Lucifer is your Jehovah. How are you going to work that one out, pal?
That's great. Wow.
I've thought that as well. I've thought that it's amazing. It's amazing that you're putting that.
I'm sorry, but what kind of God would demand blood sacrifices?
Well, this is fantastic, isn't it? Here we go. I mean, this opens up the whole, absolutely, what God would. And, of course, one can say leniently that blood sacrifice is a metaphor for you giving off your own energy to seek the light. But then there's a bunch of people who take that literally. As George Maxwell said, hey, chump, what are you doing digging out my heart? He's offering up your heart. They literally believe it's a blood sacrifice. So, again, wow, what's been done in the name of religion is really, really colossal.
Yeah,
Wow.
I completely agree. Definitely. Let me ask you this. God, that's a great topic, religion. Should we keep on going?
Do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Chris
Well,
loves to
I
bash
can do
religion,
about
so.
15 more minutes with you guys before I got to go. I got an appointment. I got to go.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
perfect. Then let me get to some of these email questions then. Somebody in the chat room asked, is there a connection between Illuminati and alumni?
The words are the same. And I would say that to a certain extent, yes, because the fraternities in school that use terms like alumni and so on, yeah, they're fraternities that if you go along to get along and matriculate as they want, sure, you're going to end up,
Okay.
maybe being a member of the Illuminati or something like that. So, but the words just mean enlightenment or enlightened ones.
Okay. Another question from the chat room is, in your tarot readings, have you seen anything for this year?
No, because I haven't been doing it quite that way. I've been more looking at the whole cycle we're in and the symbolism of Pluto. And I've spoken that a lot on other shows, so people can go to the What's New page of my forum, and they'll see other shows that I've done on that subject of the movement Pluto and what's going on in this particular age. It's very interesting. And Pluto is, of course, the planet of deconstruction. So that's why we talked about earlier that if people get into the mode of deconstructive thinking, everything will be cool. They'll really get their pieces of the truth in the puzzle. It'll all fall into place. But if people remain with this solar sort of strictly Jupiterian, strictly mercurial way of thinking, well, that's not going to gel quite right. You need a balance of everything, of course. But Pluto is now in town, and he's asking for a certain kind of different way of understanding things and a different attitude. But yeah, we've talked about that on many other things. People can also go to the article I did. It's right there on the Michael Tsarion website, 2012, Shiva and the Age of Awakening. They can go to that and talk about it there too.
Let me ask you this. Another question from the email. Do you agree with the goals of the Illuminati and the Luciferians that they're trying to basically make the United States a third world country? Would you agree that they're trying to do that?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely do believe that's been going on. I believe it's going on for hundreds of years. I believe the Constitution was a wolf in sheep's clothing methodology of attaining that. I believe that from the very outset, and people can read my Constitution Con article, which is again on the Michael Tsarion website. I go into that. They don't have to read it all if they don't want to. Just read some part of it to get up to speed on that. And I've got plenty of links and sources as well to other scholars who've toyed with that idea. I don't think anybody's gone into it with as much depth as is possibly needed, although there have been some people who have. And I would say that the outsourcing, the unlimited immigration, and just the kind of creatures that you've got running the shop, who are clearly allied with the British aristocracy. If people go to Weapons of Mass Destruction Found, this is an article I did, it's also on the Michael Tsarion website, I have the quotes there from these people, from the Kissingers and from all these other creatures. I have the quotes from the Kennedys and these other people talking about their sycophantic appreciation, you see, of the British royals and all of this heresy. And then in the Constitution Con article, where I go into this much deeper, we have the quotes from King George III that during the War of Independence, and the British knew they were losing, this man, this king, swore eternal war against America. And believe me, these people's word is taken as law for people. And so his henchmen, and this includes the modern-day Windsor family, all of these people from that time onwards are doing his bidding. They have not changed. All that's changed is their tactics. They now do it with a velvet glove, with a smile on their face, by moving into the countercultural elements, by funding all sorts of think tanks and orgs, and as I said, countercultural pundits and movements and the media. They control it almost thoroughly now through your Henry Luces and through your Catherine Grahams and your Colin Powells and Michael Powells and all of these other people who run the media through these creatures like Ted Turner, and Rupert Murdoch. All of these individuals. I mean, America is infested now, literally infested with these creatures. And there is sparks of optimism, because as I said, these people can't control the whole world, right? Which is why they use these strategical methodologies. But ultimately, America is in dire straits, and they are slowly eviscerating the country, slowly undoing its material basis.
Well, we know that America was founded on Atlantean principles. The Founding Fathers were very Atlantean in the way they perceived the New World. And
it was set up to be the new Atlantis.
Yeah. And do you think that we're going to end up just like the old Atlantis, having to make a choice and possibly be destroyed if we make the wrong one?
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Now, of course, speaking purely personally, I have a very different relationship with death and deconstruction than most people listening to the sound of my voice. But even leaving that aside, yep, the answer is yes. If people do not live in rightness, if they uproot what is important, if they desecrate the creations and the wisdom of their ancestors, have you any idea what the price of that is? The men and women who died in wars, the people who died in factories, you think they're dead? They're not dead. They're very much alive. Their spirit is alive. And their children who dance on their graves, who spit on their legacy, and who throw the beautiful creations that they've made into the fire will absolutely inherit perdition. And it doesn't matter if you do it under the guise of Christianity or waving some flag or in forgetfulness and say, well, Doc, I didn't realize what was happening. Through ignorance or through escape, it's immaterial. And I don't care if that escapism is some domestic minutia, rubbish, or some high-fluting New Age philosophy, or even higher. Because there's millions of escapes. There's so many escapes. The world is filled with escapes. It doesn't matter. There are fundamental facts of life that keep consciousness healthy and clean, and those are being desecrated by the day. We have very sinister people at the helm of the ship of state, who are making this happen, and we have to deal with it. And you don't deal with it without studying their nature, their footprint, their particular way of thinking. It's not pleasant. I wish we didn't have to do it, but that's the fact. You've got to become very sharp, and ultimately you outwit them. Ultimately you outmaneuver them. You become so damn smart, and you become so immune psychologically and morally that they cannot defeat you. I said this in the last chapter of the Atlantis book, and I continue to say it today. It's purely martial arts. It's pure Aikido. When you have become so strong and so vigilant and so aware that you know everything, every trick in the book that these people can do, they've lost their power. But going after them, both politically or militaristically or any other way, is useless because they're too smart for that. They know that. They know where you're coming. And they've already mined the field. They already have got you down because they know It's like being Irish. Do you think I don't know this? The Irishman has so many Irishmen down through history have brought about their own ruin because of their hot blood and their passion. Very good things. These are virtues. But taken too far, you see, you play right into the hands of the cold, detached evil that runs the world, you see, because you have what is called passion and you have what is called a temper. In many ways that can be good, but it also can be the downfall, and very much the same thing applies to the rest of the world. If you think that being a mugger, which is what the Masons use, this is the term for the people in the streets, the ignorant, if you think that being a mug and a mugger is going to be able to, topple these people, then you're well wrong. And people like C.S. Lewis, my mentor, and Tolkien, Professor Tolkien, they labored a great effort to show you this, to teach you this, to teach the world this. And that's why I said at the beginning of our interview that even Blavatsky was a disciple of the self, disciple of autonomy, sovereignty, psychic sovereignty, and ultimately psychological sovereignty, moral superiority. And all of those things are being eroded right now. And therefore, there's going to be no way. And again, I emphasize that our ancestors did things right the first time. That's how you can build a pyramid, that we can't even have a clue today how to do it. There's this legacy that tells us that there was great wisdom in the past. Man hasn't evolved from some sort of primitivism. He has devolved from a very, very high spiritual and moral state.
I agree.
And yet, there is always opportunities to defeat evil because we're in a state of challenge. This is a challenge. This is something that we need to realize definitely can be won. But if you're using the wrong strategy, well then, or let's put it this way, if you have identified either consciously or unconsciously with your enemy, if they've been able to insinuate their poison, their infection into you, well then of course it's not going to happen. Most of the world, you see, has identified with the thinking and the traits of the enemy. And this is then the psychic dictatorship. This is the problem.
Let me jump in for a minute. I know we're kind of pressed for time, and I want to get a couple of these questions in to make sure everybody gets their voice heard. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the significance of being in the dark according to the Mayan calendar? Do you have anything to say on that topic?
Being in the dark?
That's being in the night. I'm sorry.
That's not something I'm not familiar with, no.
Okay.
Sorry.
Another question. Do you have any thoughts on Kubrick's last work, Eyes Wide Shut?
I think we've talked about this in the Age of Manipulation conference we're doing here, this series, and we deal with that and many other films like that. And I do believe that was a whistleblowing film.
Okay.
And I do believe he was taken out because of it, because he was probably an insider who had a humanitarian streak or just an artistic bent or whatever you want to call it, and did, of course the movie itself is loaded with whistleblowing motifs, just like his other films. There's certain elements of like pedophilia concepts in Lolita, even though the story is dramatically very interesting, but on the other aspect there is certain pernicious aspects. Same thing with Eyes Wide Shut, and I feel that even though that movie was basically a remake of several other films, like To the Devil a Daughter and The Devil Rides Out and Beyond the Green Door and Eye of the Devil, these are the four I can mention, it was basically nothing more than a remake. However, probably because he was an insider, I think they did retaliate against him very much in the same way that they retaliate against Jim Keith and various other people you see that they feel are insiders who go too far by letting things be known or whatever.
Let me go to one more question. Actually, a few different people have been asking this one. What are your thoughts on past lives? Do you have any thoughts on your own past life? And do you feel any kind of connection to Atlantis from past lives?
I can't answer that because I never speak about my own private life. I try to keep my professional and private life totally separate.
Okay.
So I can't speak about my own personal life or experiences or whatever you want to call it.
Okay, fair enough.
But I certainly, and in general, I do not believe in reincarnation or past lives, or at least in the sense that it's mostly been transmitted to us. And the reason is because the original unadulterated theory of reincarnation and karma and these kinds of concepts are very different from the way that they got skewed by the priestly schools that most people know it from. So there's actually two different concepts. For instance, the Druids spoke about something called the transmigration of souls. You know, I can't remember the technical term for it right now, but and on paper that sounds like it's the same thing as reincarnation, in which an individual, right, like Chris, he himself, in somewhat of the same consciousness, reincarnates through different lives or different bodies, right? This is how it's become interpreted now. Mm-hmm. Actually, the original concept, which was held by the Druids, is not that at all. It's more like that when you die, your spirit returns to nature and enters into the matrix, which is the all-knowing intelligence, right? But it's not specifically you as you know yourself to be, because that's so much to do with persona and superficial, you know, the shell, the sort of ego level of our ideas about ourselves. None of that's going to transmute over, you see. So there are slight differences. And then I'm very worried, you see, about all of these esoteric doctrines, because I've studied this through and through, and therefore I know that there's a different doctrine in the ancient tantric understanding of it thousands of years ago, as these teachings were tweaked. And just like I've spoken so often about how Druidic teachings in the West later became the pseudo version, right? Pseudo-Druidism is nothing more than Christianity and Judaism. Well, that's what happened in the Far East. In India and in China, the same ancient teachings of the Tantrists was taken, plagiarized, and then totally obscured, partially transmogrified into these Eastern versions that we have today, which talk about the wheel of karma, the wheel of cycle of life and death, that if you commit sins in this life, you know, you're going to be reincarnated and you can go up and down the scale and all of these things. And that stuff to me is very, very suspect. I don't believe in it in that way. But to talk any further about it would just take far too long. It's very elaborate. It was a good question, though. It's very interesting. And I just think that there's been too much priestly contamination of these concepts, even though I encourage people to really study it and think about it. And very, very important to do that.
Absolutely. And I have one more question that was important. I should have asked this in the beginning of the broadcast, but who was Alice Bailey? What was the Lucifer Trust Company? How did Hitler tie into Theosophy and Blavatsky? And I know it's a big question, but can you maybe just put something on for the record?
Well, all I can say, I mean, you can just look. People can look this up on the internet. I mean, just go to Wikipedia and type in these names, and you'll learn so much from there. But certainly, the tradition is that the Fabian network, which is ultimately a royalist network, because on paper it's meant to be socialist. The Bertrand Russells and the George Bernard Shaws and the Sidney Webbs and all of these Fabians like Alice Bailey and all of their little spin-offs and little offspring on paper are meant to be socialists, which often can be mistaken as being anti-royalist. But of course, if you look beneath that veil, you'll find that these people are whining and dining with royalty. So obviously they're not in any way really truly anti-royalist. It's nonsense. In fact, some of the most important Fabians went to Oxford and Cambridge universities, right? The Fabian movement was pretty much started there. The London School of Economics, for instance, which is a Fabian headquarters, basically, you know, has trained some of the top politicians of the world, not only the economists and so many other dignitaries. And this was for the Round Table organizations and so many other organizations. And the royal stamp is all over them, all right? The Cecil Roses and the Lord Alfred Milners and so many of these other people are completely controlled by the Alpha Lodges of Freemasonry. And they're all royal, by the way. It's controlled by the Order of St. Michael and St. George. And is controlled by the Order of the Garter, the Club of the Isles, the Mount Perelin Society, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and so many other royalist orgs. The list goes on. And they themselves are merely bastard children of the old Templar, you see, organizations from much earlier on, right? Then, okay, how does this tie into Hitler? On paper, you'll often read continually that Hitler and his henchmen were all influenced by Madame Blavatsky, the evil Madame Blavatsky, and the Lucifer Trust, and all of this nonsense. As we said at the beginning of the conversation, yeah, there were certain people who borrowed and plagiarized and sort of liberally borrowed symbolism and even partly ideology. I mean, the story of the root races that Blavatsky had written about as an intellectual scholar was then picked up by people. But see, you've got to realize that somebody can come along and borrow and plagiarize a teacher's work. Doesn't mean that that teacher has endorsed those people. That teacher may still think of that person as a blatant plagiarizer or as a blatant misconstruer of their work.
Right.
I agree.
Madame Blavatsky was not hanging around any Nazis. Madame Blavatsky was not shaking hands
she
with
was
any of
dead
these
by
people.
that time. Anyway.
No, or nor even the proto-versions. There's been no actual logical connection that she really endorsed people like Bulwer Lytton or any of these other people. Far from it. She was not in bed with any of the Jewish bankers who funded Hitler, period. She was not in with any of the Jesuits who were so much involved with fascism, both of German and Italian and other forms. My God, as I said at the beginning, she was trying to expose those people. It's a contradiction to say that then she was their best chum. And secondly, she was not a proto-Nazi any more than Nietzsche was. But then the Guido von Lists, the von Liebenfelds, you see, and all of these proto-Nazis who are actually really called Ariosophists, and I've dealt with them in Volume 1 of the Irish Origins book to show you that they have no connection to the true meaning of the word Aryan. They're guilty of totally bending and skewing that word even worse than Madame Blavatsky did, and that they also have really no connection to Theosophy. But these evil arcs were very crafty at being able to use a lot of Masonic and Pan-Masonic stuff. With one hand, they suppress they suppress German and Austrian Freemasonic lodges. Hitler's even known for doing that, and they think, oh, what a great guy to be anti-Masonic. No. He just wanted to supplant his own form of Masonry because he knew that certain Masons are moral people and are philanthropists and won't go along with this gig, with this pretty much Zionist, socialist gig that is also very aristocratic based, you see. So he had to purge the kind of Freemasons he didn't like. It wasn't about getting rid of Freemasonry. What nonsense. It's about setting up the kind of Freemasonry they want so they won't have opposition from the other kind, right? Okay, then you find out that the Thule Society, which is aristocratic, and even its members of, I believe it's members of the Thule Society that actually mind-controlled Hitler. I believe that Adolf Hitler himself was a double agent. He worked for, not a double agent, but he worked for the British intelligence. He was their agent. More than that, I think he was mind-controlled as well, which explains a lot of his behavior and even his somnambulistic traits. Mm-hmm. And I believe it might have been Dietrich Eckhart or one of these other occultists that belonged to the Thule Society. But the Thule Society, just like the Armanenschaft and the German Order, were controlled by Masonry, very high-level Masonry. All these groups that are behind Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party. I mean, Adolf Hitler one minute is a corporal in the army, and the next minute he turns up at the German Workers' Party with $1 million Deutschmarks in gold. $1 million Deutschmarks in gold. How is it possible? It's because he's funded by the elites. All right, he was their agent. It's a no-brainer. Then you turn to the fact of all these British connections, the connections between the British aristocrats. I mean, not only their ambassador von Ribbentrop, but Rudolf Hess was always flying back and forth to England to get the orders, right? Finally, his plane crashed, so then they had to cover it up by saying, oh, what was Hess doing flying to England? You think he only did it the one time? What are you talking about? They all have to go to England to find out what the rules are. They're being given their orders from New York City and from London. There's nothing German about the Nazis. The Nazis were there to destroy Germany, to undermine Germany forever. Because Germany represents a tremendous threat for thousands of years. There's been Germanophobia. People should study the history of Germany as it really is, not the garbage that's been taught to us. And therefore the Nazis were a order created by Masonry and British intelligence to undermine the German people in the country of Germany and to wipe them out, and also to embroil people in a blood ritual, the Anglo-Saxon Caucasian race, both of France and America and also England, to come together in a mass Holocaust for much broader reasons than I've gone into my work. It was nothing more than a huge blood ritual. And finally, some of the generals started to understand this because, of course, strategically, things were happening that were just absolutely irrational and inconceivable and insane. But it was too late. By the time people worked this out, that obviously Hitler could not be German for Germany, it was too late. The damage had already been done. How this ties into Blavatsky? Right. Well, the Ariosophists, like Guido von List and von Liebenfels and all these proto-Nazis, pretty much insane guys, lunatic people, there's many others that I could mention in this field, I have their pictures, and I have the chapter on it in the volume 1 of the Irish Origins book. These individuals drew upon her work because it was a work of genius, and they knew that they could skew it in another way, right? And present it to the people. They needed something. They needed archive information. They wanted theories so that they could set their whole gig up. And of course, down the line, the people who are in less knowledge about what's really going on the occult level, they get fascinated by this. They misinterpret the word Aryan. Blavatsky gets the blame. You know, Germany sends off all these anthropologists and scholars around the world to take measurements and dig up old places and say, oh yeah, there was this Aryan race. And the whole thing just becomes a total hodgepodge of nonsense, all right? There's reasons for that. There's nothing to do with the purer teachings at all. But the people who actually did the funding, the people who brought these people to power, like the von Thyssen family and the Helmut Schlacks of the world, you see, and the people who advised. One of the most important advisors to know about is a guy called Haushofer, Karl Haushofer.
Uh-huh. Did we lose him?
Oh my gosh. Where is he?
Huh.
That was weird.
I can't hear him. Oh, call dropped. Let's see if we can get it back on.
Yeah.
That's what happens with these Skype calls after a while.
That's okay.
Yeah, we just need to do a little wrap-up. I know he's got to go.
Yeah.
The person whom you're trying to reach is currently unavailable.
Uh-oh.
That's okay. Do you wanna just wrap it up?
That's weird. Our caller lines went dead, too.
That is weird.
Yeah. I wonder
Are
if
we
my-
still streaming?
Yeah, I wonder if my internet dropped.
Do we check?
Yeah, we are streaming.
Okay, good. Sorry, everyone out there. Well, that was a really interesting conversation, though.
That was.
That was. We've had some amazing guests the past couple months, but Michael Tsarion is probably one of my
The
favorites.
person whom you're trying...
Maybe it was his computer that went down or something.
I don't know.
Oh, well.
We'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah. Michael Tsarion's websites are michaeltsarion.com, architectsofcontrol.com as well, and he will be appearing at the Conspiracy Conference. I think it's June 5th and 6th.
I believe so. We should
Okay.
go.
Yeah, I want to see if we can get him on one more time for a wrap-up.
Okay. Let's see. Conspiracy Con. Yes, I know.
It might have been a problem with his computer because I can't seem to get through to him again.
I must apologize to all the
The
listeners out
person
there
whom you're trying to reach...
for my very loud keyboard.
It's all right. It's all right. Let's see. Coming up next week, this Saturday, we're going to have Chris Everard on, and he's the mastermind behind Secret Space and the Illuminati. Those films are great films if you haven't seen those. Tex Mars, the Saturday after that. We're thinking about taking April 15th off because we've done so much radio lately.
We're a little
Well,
tired.
check the website and see what the schedule is like. But I think we're going to take this Thursday off. But we'll definitely be back on the air on Saturday. And that was Michael Tsarion. I'm going to try calling him one more time to see if we can get a wrap up.
And yes, that conspiracy conference is June 5th and 6th in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they're going to have lots of great speakers there. Dr. Len Horowitz, Bill Deagle, Jim Tucker, H. Michael Sweeney, Tex Mars.
Yeah, I think maybe there's something wrong with his computer.
Okay, Michael S. Hoffman, Michael Tsarion, Stan Monteith, Anthony Hilder. I mean, there's just
that's going to be great.
We need to go.
We need to go to that for sure. Let's see. Anything else?
I think that's pretty much it.
That's it? Do we run the intro? I mean the outro?
The outro, yeah.
All right. What did I do with it? I'm all unorganized over here. Sorry.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Yeah, everybody in the chat room has been great. Great questions from everybody. And should we try one more time? Why not?
Okay.
Let's see. I hate to end the interview without doing a little, wrap up. Thank you and all that.
I know.
I mean, he spent so much time with us. He was so gracious
4
with his
hours.
time.
4 hours.
I know.
And he was with us for 4 hours last time, wasn't he?
Yeah, he's a great guest. He really is. I mean, he's very well spoken. He's knowledgeable. He's very gracious with his time.
The person whom you're trying to...
And apparently his Skype is not working. So
that's okay.
Anyways, I guess that's it.